After 10 years in federal prison for a crime I did not commit, my partner took my $56 million company and my wife. I quietly called my lawyer and said, "Your time is up." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who underestimated your worth. My name is Wendell. I am 68 years old, and my absolute ruin began the moment I trusted the wrong man. The freezing November rain lashed against my face. I stood before the towering wrought iron gates of the $12 million estate I purchased 20 years ago. I built my logistics empire from a single delivery truck working 90-hour weeks to afford this exact piece of land. The steel felt freezing beneath my calloused hands. I punched my 6-digit security code into the keypad. A harsh red error light blinked back at me. I tried again. The machine denied my entry. I pressed the intercom button. Static crackled through the speaker, followed by a voice I spent 3,650 nights trying to forget. "State your business," Derek demanded. His voice carried the distinct, arrogant drawl of a man drinking expensive scotch. "Open the gate, Derek," I said. My voice was a low, steady rumble. I did not yell. 10 years in a federal penitentiary strips a man of the urge to raise his voice unnecessarily. I served the 10 years. I kept my mouth shut. The deal is complete. There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. The heavy iron gates slowly swung open. I walked up the long, winding driveway. The gravel crunched under my standard-issue prison boots. Every step brought back a memory of the life I sacrificed. I took the plea deal a decade ago because Derek promised to protect my equity and shield my daughter Kendra from being falsely implicated in the scandal. I believed I was saving my family. I approached the grand mahogany front doors. Derek stood on the porch. He was wearing my custom silk robe. He held a crystal glass in his right hand. Yvonne stepped out from the shadows behind him. My wife. She wore a diamond necklace I commissioned for our 20th anniversary. She wrapped her arm around Derek's waist. She did not look me in the eye. She stared firmly at the wet asphalt. "You look terrible," Wendell, Derek said, taking a sip of his drink. "Prison aged you. You look like a ghost." "I am a ghost to the federal government," I replied, stepping onto the porch. I took the fall for the falsified shipping manifests. I shielded the company from the federal raid. You promised to protect my shares and my family. I am here to collect my equity. Derek laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. "Your equity. You are a convicted felon, Wendell. You hold no equity. The board of directors voted unanimously to dissolve your shares 7 years ago to save the brand's reputation. I own the logistics empire now. I own this estate. I own everything." My jaw tightened. I did not lash out. I observed. I calculated. Derek orchestrated the entire federal investigation to eliminate me. He stole my life's work. The dissolution of my shares was a calculated theft. He used my absence to rewrite the corporate hierarchy and consolidate his power. "You have nowhere to go," Derek continued, his smile widening. "You have $30 in your pocket and a felony record. However, I am a generous man. The groundskeeper quit yesterday. The utility room in the unheated stables is empty. You can sleep there. You will clear the brush, wash the vehicles, and stay out of sight. In exchange, I will not call your parole officer and report you for trespassing." Yvonne finally looked up. "Take the job, Wendell. Please, do not make this difficult." Her voice lacked any trace of the woman I loved. She traded our 30-year marriage for financial security and social status. I looked at the man who stole my world. I needed access to the estate. I needed access to his physical files. I needed to get inside. "I will take the job," I stated quietly. Derek smirked. "Go around to the back. Use the service entrance. Do not track mud on my hardwood floors." I turned my back on them and walked toward the rear of the estate. The humiliation burned in my chest like a hot, suffocating coal. I did not feel defeated. I felt a precise, chilling clarity. They believed they reduced a 68-year-old titan of industry to a beggar. They simply invited the architect of their destruction inside the walls. The rain intensified as I navigated the stone pathway leading to the massive equestrian stables at the edge of the property. I built those stables for Kendra when she was a teenager. Now they were my designated prison cell. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The air inside smelled of damp hay, rotting wood, and old motor oil. A single flickering bulb illuminated a rusted cot and a pile of discarded cardboard boxes. I dropped my small canvas bag onto the thin mattress. The cold air seeped through the thin walls, promising a miserable night. My attention was immediately drawn away from the cot. I walked toward the back stalls. I saw a bright orange glow flickering against the wooden beams. The sharp smell of burning plastic and scorched wood filled the stale air. Wyatt stood over a rusted metal trash barrel. He was tossing armfuls of paper and framed photographs into the flames. He was the junior marketing executive I hired right before my indictment. He was a deeply unqualified white man who married my daughter while I was locked away in a cell. He was heavily intoxicated, swaying unsteadily on his feet as he threw a heavy wooden plaque into the fire. I recognized the brass lettering immediately, even as the flames began to lick the edges. It was my Lifetime Achievement Award for Structural Engineering. Wyatt was systematically destroying the last remaining physical evidence of my legacy. He was erasing my history from the estate to sanitize the environment for Derek. The fire crackled loudly, consuming documents containing my original architectural designs and operational blueprints for the logistics company. Every piece of paper he burned was a piece of the foundation I laid with my own hands. I watched him reach into another cardboard box and pull out a stack of my personal journals. He did not care about the history he was incinerating. He only cared about following Derek's orders to erase my existence. My silence was no longer a sign of submission. It was the calculated silence of a man preparing to strike back. The flames licked higher against the rusted rim of the metal barrel. I stood perfectly still in the shadows of the stable door. Wyatt swayed dangerously close to the fire. He held my original schematics, the foundational blueprints for the automated routing system that built the $56 million empire Derek now claimed as his own. Wyatt tossed them into the inferno. The paper curled and blackened instantly. He laughed, a wet, sloppy sound that echoed in the cavernous space. My hands curled into tight fists at my sides. A single step forward in the dark would permanently end him. 10 years in a federal maximum security facility teaches a man how to dismantle a threat with absolute efficiency. I could shatter his jaw and drop him onto the concrete floor before he registered my presence. But violence was a luxury I could no longer afford. Striking my white son-in-law on my first night out would trigger an immediate parole violation. Derek relied on my anger. I expected me to lash out and send myself back to a cell. I refused to grant him that victory. I stood back and watched Wyatt pick up a heavy brass and walnut plaque. It was the Industry Innovator Award I received 20 years ago, presented on the very night I paid for Kendra's college tuition in full. Wyatt sneered at the engraved plate. He tossed it carelessly onto the burning pile. The brass hissed as it struck the hot coals. Wyatt reached into the cardboard box for more, but his drunken lack of coordination betrayed him. He missed the edge of the box, scraping his knuckles against the rough cardboard. He let out a sharp curse, kicked the box in frustration, and staggered backward. He wiped his bleeding hand on his cashmere sweater. Destroying my history exhausted him. He kicked the side of the barrel one last time, sending a shower of orange sparks into the damp air. He turned and stumbled toward the exit. I pressed my back flat against the cold wooden beams, holding my breath. Wyatt passed within 2 feet of me, reeking of expensive gin and cheap cologne. He pushed the stable doors open and staggered across the wet lawn toward the main estate. The heavy door swung shut behind him. I stepped out of the shadows. I moved rapidly toward the blazing barrel. The heat radiated against my face, fighting the freezing November wind slipping through the cracks. I grabbed the heavy green rubber garden hose coiled tightly against the nearest horse stall. I cranked the rusted brass spigot to maximum pressure. I aimed the nozzle directly into the center of the flames. The pressurized water blasted into the barrel. A violent hiss erupted as the fire fought the freezing water. Thick plumes of gray smoke and steam billowed toward the rafters, stinging my eyes and coating my throat with the bitter taste of burned paper. I kept the water trained on the metal base until the orange embers died completely, leaving a blackened ruin. I dropped the heavy rubber hose to the ground. I plunged my bare hands directly into the smoking, toxic slush. The water was scalding, but I ignored the pain. I dug through the destroyed remnants. My fingers brushed against solid wood. I gripped the edge and pulled the award plaque from the sludge. The brass plate was severely warped and coated in soot. The top half of the walnut base was charred black, crumbling slightly under my grip. I carried the ruined plaque to the small wooden table near my assigned cot. I grabbed a rusted flathead screwdriver left by the previous groundskeeper. I wedged the metal tip beneath the brass plate and pried it upward with a sharp, violent twist. The metal snapped off, revealing the solid wooden core beneath. I turned the plaque over and brought the handle of the screwdriver down hard against the center of the wood. The charred walnut splintered and cracked down the middle. Hidden perfectly within a tiny, custom-routed cavity was a small, sealed plastic capsule. I broke the capsule open. A pristine black micro-USB drive fell into my palm. I stared at the tiny piece of hardware. I placed it there 15 years ago when Derek first started showing signs of extreme greed. This drive contained the original, unalterable source code for our entire global logistics network. Derek dissolved my shares and seized the entity, but he operated on a replicated system. I held the master key. I quietly wiped the black soot from my hands. Holding the drive was useless without a machine to read the encrypted files. I slipped the drive deep into the heavy front pocket of my damp canvas jacket. I needed a secure corporate device. I knew Wyatt kept a storage bin of discarded company electronics near his luxury sports car in the main garage. I pushed the stable doors open and stepped into the freezing rain. I moved silently across the expansive lawn using the massive oak trees for cover. I designed this estate 2 decades ago. I knew every blind spot in the security camera network. I reached the side entrance of the massive 4-car garage. The digital keypad glowed a dull green in the dark. I bypassed the electronic lock using a simple tension technique I learned from a master safecracker in cell block 4. I slid a rigid wire into the mechanical override slot and applied upward pressure. The heavy metal door clicked open smoothly. I stepped inside the garage. The air was warm and smelled faintly of expensive leather and car wax. I navigated carefully around Derek's pristine silver luxury sedan and Wyatt's bright red sports car parked nearby. I located the plastic storage bins stacked against the far wall. I quietly unlatched the top container and dug through a tangle of charging cables and discarded promotional materials. My fingers closed around the cold, sleek aluminum casing of a corporate tablet. I pulled the device out and carefully inspected the dark, shattered screen under the moonlight. It was an older model but fully functional. I slipped the device into the interior pocket of my jacket alongside the USB drive. I turned to walk back toward the side door. Suddenly, the overhead fluorescent lights snapped on with a loud electronic hum. The sudden brightness blinded me temporarily. I quickly raised my right hand to shield my tired eyes from the blinding glare. A shadow shifted in the doorway connecting the garage to the main house. Kendra stood there silently. My only daughter, the person I had sacrificed everything to protect. She wore a very expensive designer silk robe, but her entire posture was rigid with raw aggression. She held a heavy iron golf club gripped tightly in her right hand, raised and ready to swing. Her face was extremely pale and dark, heavy circles shadowed her eyes. I noticed a distinct yellowish bruise forming around her left wrist. She glared at me, her knuckles turning white around the iron grip. I stood perfectly still in the dead silence, watching the absolute hatred burning deeply in her dark eyes as she prepared to strike me. I did not flinch as the heavy iron head of the golf club hovered inches from my skull. Kendra gripped the leather handle so tightly her knuckles turned bone white under the harsh fluorescent lights of the garage. She stepped forward, her expensive silk robe billowing slightly in the cold draft. Her free hand slid into the deep pocket of her robe, pulling out a sleek mobile phone. Her thumb hovered over the emergency dial screen. She did not blink. 10 years had erased the bright, optimistic girl I raised and replaced her with a hardened, terrified woman. "You have exactly 3 seconds to put that tablet on the hood of the car," she ordered, her voice completely devoid of a daughter's affection. "If you move toward me, I will swing this club. If you try to run, I will call the local police. A parole violation for theft will send you back to federal prison before sunrise." I kept my hands perfectly still and visible at chest height. I did not attempt to close the distance between us. "I took the fall to protect you, Kendra," I stated quietly. "I kept the feds away from your bank accounts." Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Do not dare speak to me about protection," she hissed, taking another aggressive step forward. "You bankrupted this family with your greed. You destroyed my life. Have you forgotten what day the federal agents raided the company? It was my wedding day. Hundreds of armed agents swarmed the country club. They froze our accounts while I was standing at the altar. They humiliated me in front of 300 guests. My friends watched the government seize our assets. I was a laughingstock. You left us with nothing. Derek stepped in when you failed. He paid the lawyers. Wyatt stood by me when the scandal broke. They saved me from absolute poverty. You are nothing but a convicted criminal sneaking around in the dark trying to steal from the men who actually kept this family afloat." The venom in her words was genuine. Derek had spent 3,650 days controlling the narrative. He had groomed her to view him as the savior and me as the monster. I listened to her breathe heavily, her chest heaving with a decade of manufactured rage. I did not argue with her fabricated reality. Debating the truth of the federal raid would only escalate her panic and guarantee police intervention. I shifted my focus from her angry words to her physical condition. My eyes locked onto her left wrist protruding from the sleeve of her silk robe, a dark yellowish-purple bruise wrapped entirely around the joint. It was not a contusion from a simple fall. It was the unmistakable shape of a man's aggressive grip. The thumbprint impression was clearly visible against her pale skin. The pieces of the puzzle aligned in my mind with cold, terrifying precision. The expensive designer clothes she wore were nothing more than a glittering cage. Derek and Wyatt were not protecting her. They were actively controlling her. Wyatt's drunken, volatile behavior in the stables earlier that night perfectly matched the psychological profile of a domestic abuser. They kept her isolated, feeding her lies about my crimes to ensure she never questioned their authority over the estate and the corporate finances. Arguing with a hostage suffering from Stockholm Syndrome was a tactical error. She needed absolute proof of their deception, not empty promises from a paroled father she deeply despised. I slowly lowered my hands to my sides. I reached into the interior pocket of my damp canvas jacket. Kendra instantly raised the golf club higher, her muscles tensing for a violent swing. I moved with deliberate slowness, extracting the silver corporate tablet I had taken from the storage bin. I extended my arm and placed the device gently onto the pristine hood of Derek's luxury sedan. I took 2 slow, measured steps backward, creating a safe physical distance between us. "I surrender the device, Kendra," I said calmly. "I am not here to cause you pain. I am simply fulfilling the landscaping duties Derek assigned to me. You have your property back." Her breathing remained ragged. She kept her eyes locked on my face as she cautiously maneuvered around the front bumper of the vehicle. She did not lower the heavy iron club. She moved with the skittish hypervigilance of a prey animal expecting a sudden trap. I maintained a neutral, non-threatening posture. The immediate goal was to defuse the violent confrontation and remain on the estate grounds. Every passing second I stayed out of police custody was a crucial victory. Kendra reached the hood of the sedan. She snatched the tablet with her bruised hand, pulling it tightly against her chest. Her eyes darted rapidly between me and the side entrance of the garage. "You are a disease," she whispered, her voice cracking under the intense emotional strain. "Stay away from my husband. Stay away from my home." In a sudden, erratic burst of raw frustration, she raised the tablet high above her head and hurled it violently toward the ground. The heavy aluminum device struck the solid concrete floor with a sickening crunch. The impact echoed loudly across the cavernous garage. She did not wait to see the damage. She spun around, sprinted through the doorway leading into the main house, and slammed the heavy steel fire door behind her. The loud metallic clack of the deadbolt sliding into place signaled my complete isolation. I stood alone in the quiet garage. I walked over to the spot where the device had landed. I knelt on the cold concrete and picked up the tablet. The protective glass was completely shattered, forming a dense, jagged spiderweb pattern across the entire display. However, the internal LCD backlight still bled faintly through the countless cracks. The hardware had survived the violent impact. I pressed my thumb firmly against the side power button. The system booted up with a low hum. The corporate logo flashed across the fractured screen, but it did not load the standard operating system. The brutal physical shock had triggered an emergency anti-tamper protocol deeply embedded in the device's hardware. A stark red warning banner dominated the display. The system demanded a biometric override to access the hard drive. A simple alphanumeric passcode was no longer sufficient. The security firewall required the primary user's direct physical thumbprint to unlock the encrypted sectors. I stared at the flashing red prompt. I had the micro USB drive containing the $56 million source code safely hidden in my pocket. I had the corporate device capable of reading the encrypted files. Both were rendered completely useless without the biological key. The challenge escalated immediately. I needed to extract a pristine physical fingerprint from an aggressive, paranoid, and highly volatile corporate executive. I could not drug him. I could not assault him. I had to hunt my son-in-law in broad daylight right in front of the people who wanted me dead. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on my shoulders as I dragged a heavy canvas tarp loaded with wet mulch across the meticulously manicured lawn. The coarse fabric of my gray groundskeeper uniform clung to my sweating back. Less than 50 yards away on the expansive flagstone patio, Yvonne was hosting a lavish garden luncheon for a dozen local socialites. The sharp clinking of fine silverware and the hollow trill of manufactured laughter drifted across the blooming hydrangeas. I kept my head down and focused entirely on the heavy iron shears in my hand. I systematically trimmed the thick hedges lining the perimeter of the patio. My physical proximity to the gathering was deliberate. I needed to remain completely invisible while maintaining a direct line of sight to the outdoor bar. Wyatt sat slouched in a wrought iron chair at the edge of the patio, physically distancing himself from Yvonne's wealthy friends. He looked irritable and deeply hungover from his destructive binge the night before. He waved a white-gloved waiter over and demanded a refill. I watched closely as the waiter poured a generous measure of expensive scotch into a heavy crystal tumbler. Wyatt snatched the glass before it even hit the coaster. The warm autumn air caused instant condensation to form on the chilled crystal. Wyatt gripped the glass tightly with his right hand, his thumb pressing firmly against the smooth surface. He was sweating profusely, leaving a thick residue of natural oils directly on the glass. He downed half the scotch in a single desperate swallow and slammed the tumbler back onto the wrought iron table. He rubbed his temples, completely oblivious to the fact that he just handed me the exact biological key I needed to dismantle his entire life. I continued pruning the hedges, moving slowly inch by inch toward the catering station set up near the side entrance of the estate. I had to time my interception perfectly. Snatching the glass directly from the table would draw immediate attention and risk a confrontation. I needed the catering staff to do the heavy lifting for me. I waited patiently in the shadows of the tall arborvitae bushes. 30 minutes later, the luncheon began to wind down. Yvonne ushered her guests toward the sprawling rose gardens for a private tour. Wyatt did not join them. He stood up, grabbed his ringing cell phone from his pocket, and marched inside the main house, leaving his empty crystal tumbler sitting alone on the edge of the table. A young catering busboy hurried over with a large silver tray, quickly gathering the discarded plates and glasses. I stepped out from behind the hedges and intercepted the young man just as he reached the service doors. I held up a clean white linen napkin I had taken from the catering supply box earlier that morning. I told the busboy that Yvonne had specifically requested that particular crystal tumbler be hand-washed immediately to avoid staining the antique glass. The young man looked relieved to have one less dish to carry and handed the glass directly to me. I wrapped the linen napkin carefully around the base. Inserting the thick, greasy thumbprint near the rim remained entirely untouched. I slipped through the service gate and walked swiftly back to the damp utility room in the stables. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I placed the crystal glass gently on my small wooden table next to the shattered corporate tablet. I reached into my canvas tool bag and pulled out a thick, flat carpenter's pencil and a sharp utility knife. I used the blade to carefully shave the wooden casing away from the pencil, exposing the solid core of dark graphite. I ground the lead against a piece of rough sandpaper, creating a small pile of ultra-fine black powder. I tore off a small piece of a coffee filter, dipped it into the graphite dust, and blew softly to remove the excess. I brushed the powder delicately over the smudge on the crystal glass. The intricate ridges and valleys of Wyatt's thumbprint materialized against the clear glass in sharp black contrast. I pulled a roll of clear packing tape from my bag. I cut a small square, pressed the sticky side firmly over the dusted print, and rubbed it flat with the back of my fingernail to remove any trapped air bubbles. I peeled the tape away slowly. The biometric signature lifted perfectly, trapped forever on the clear adhesive. I picked up the cracked corporate tablet. The red emergency lockdown prompt still blinked aggressively across the damaged screen, demanding physical authentication. I carefully aligned the piece of packing tape over the circular biometric scanner at the bottom of the device. I pressed my own thumb over the tape, applying firm, even pressure to mimic the natural heat and weight of a human touch. The scanner emitted a faint blue light. It read the graphite ridges captured on the tape. The red warning banner vanished instantly. A small green padlock icon appeared. The system booted directly into Wyatt's secure executive dashboard. I was inside the network. I did not waste time looking through his marketing files. I accessed the company's master email server and bypassed his personal inbox, routing directly into Derek's administrative communications. Derek was arrogant enough to believe his internal network was impenetrable, leaving his executive correspondence highly organized and unencrypted on the local drive. I opened a folder labeled simply Project Horizon. Inside was a lengthy thread of recent emails between Derek and the lead acquisition officers of a massive Asian logistics conglomerate. I read through the attached PDF files. The reality of Derek's endgame crystallized on the fractured screen. Derek was not just running my company into the ground, he was selling the entire corporate entity. The acquisition was scheduled to be finalized this Friday morning. The contract stipulated a complete liquidation of all domestic assets and a total transfer of the $56 million capital payout into a series of untraceable offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Once the Asian buyers signed the paperwork, the corporate shell would be dissolved. Derek would walk away with my stolen empire in cash, and the massive financial fraud he committed would be permanently erased from the domestic grid. I looked at the digital clock on the top corner of the tablet screen. It was Wednesday afternoon. I had exactly 48 hours to halt a $56 million international acquisition. A simple police report or a complaint to my parole officer would be entirely useless. I needed catastrophic high-level legal intervention, and I needed it immediately. I could not fight a corporate army with a garden hose and a carpenter's pencil. I needed a shark. I crouched on the damp concrete floor of the utility room, resting the cracked tablet on an overturned wooden crate. I had 48 hours before Derek signed away $56 million and vanished with the capital. A standard phone call would be intercepted immediately. Derek undoubtedly monitored all network traffic exiting the estate routers. I navigated to the tablet's internal developer settings. I manually configured a virtual private network protocol routing my connection through a series of proxy servers located in Eastern Europe. I routed the signal through 3 distinct offshore servers to ensure Derek's security department could not trace the origin point. I opened the secure voice over Internet Protocol application. I typed in a 10-digit number I had committed to memory a decade ago. I pressed the call button. The line rang twice in the pitch-black room. A sharp, gravelly voice answered on the 3rd ring. "Speak," the man demanded. "Simon," I said quietly into the device microphone. "It is Wendell. I am out." I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the encrypted line. Simon was my former chief corporate counsel. When the federal agents raided our headquarters 10 years ago, Derek immediately threw Simon under the bus, blacklisting him from every major corporate firm in the state. Simon lost his prestigious partnership, his corner office, and his reputation. He kept a small rundown practice open in the industrial district for one single reason. He was waiting for my release. Wendell Simon whispered, his voice tight with restrained adrenaline. "Where are you right now?" "I am physically inside Derek's estate," I replied. "I bypassed a security device. Derek is executing a total corporate sale to an overseas buyer on Friday morning. The contract stipulates a complete liquidation of all domestic assets. He is moving the $56 million into offshore accounts. I have the original master source code on a physical drive. We need an emergency judicial injunction before Friday. I cannot file a federal injunction based on a stolen tablet and a flash drive," Simon stated, urgently shifting into his professional legal cadence. "Derek fabricated a complete transfer of intellectual property years ago. He bribed an entire team of auditors to certify his ownership of the software algorithm. To freeze a multi-million-dollar international acquisition, I need physical possession of your original notarized software patent. Do you still have it?" "I have it," I confirmed. "But we have a severe timeline issue. Why is the board of directors allowing a total liquidation without a mandatory 90-day review period?" Derek structured the board with his own sycophants, Simon explained, the frustration evident in his tone. "However, corporate bylaws dictate that a total liquidation requires a supermajority vote. Derek controls 4 seats. He needs 5 to bypass the review period. Wyatt holds the swing vote. That is why Derek tolerates him. Wyatt is the proxy director for your daughter's inherited shares. If Wyatt votes yes tomorrow afternoon, the sale becomes legally binding by Friday morning. We have to strip Derek of his claim to the intellectual property before the board convenes." I processed the information rapidly. Derek engineered the corporate bylaws to grant Wyatt executive voting rights over Kendra's inherited shares. By keeping Wyatt intoxicated and drowning in debt, Derek controlled the entire board. It was a masterclass in corporate manipulation. Wyatt was a violent drunk, but he held the key to the entire acquisition. "I cannot leverage Wyatt without leverage of my own," I said. "I will secure the patent. A digital scan of the original document will not hold up in front of a federal judge," Simon warned. "Derek's lawyers will immediately claim it is a digitally altered forgery. The foreign buyers will ignore a pending investigation and sign the contract anyway to secure the asset. I need the physical paper. I need the wet ink signature and the raised notary seal. Bring the document to my office on 5th Street. We will file the injunction manually at the federal courthouse at dawn." The path forward was narrow and heavily guarded. I ended the secure call and wiped the application from the tablet's memory cache. I struck the cracked screen against the concrete floor one final time, entirely destroying the internal motherboard. I tossed the ruined device into a trash bin in the corner of the utility room. I had to retrieve the patent. I stored the authentic documentation in a highly secure safe deposit box at a downtown bank facility 15 years ago. Accessing the vault presented a massive logistical hurdle. Federal banking regulations require dual authentication for physical vault entry. I had the brass key safely hidden inside the sole of my prison boot, but my state-issued identification card expired 8 years ago while I was incarcerated. My temporary parole documentation would trigger an immediate secondary background check by the bank manager. I needed to formulate a method to bypass the identification protocol without triggering a silent alarm. I stood up from the wooden crate and brushed the dust from my gray canvas jacket. I walked toward the small barred window at the top of the utility room wall. I peered out across the sprawling manicured lawn. The situation was escalating faster than I anticipated. The estate was undergoing a sudden tactical transformation. 3 black, heavily armored sport utility vehicles pulled into the main driveway, blocking the exit paths. A dozen men stepped out of the vehicles. They did not wear standard security uniforms. They wore tactical dark clothing and carried high-lumen flashlights. These were not local security guards. They were highly trained military contractors paid exorbitant sums to ensure absolute perimeter integrity. I watched closely as Derek stepped out onto the front porch handing a clipboard to the lead contractor. Derek pointed toward the perimeter walls and the main iron gates. The contractors moved with rigid military efficiency. They pulled thick, heavy steel chains from the back of their vehicles and began wrapping them securely around the main estate gates, securing them with massive industrial padlocks. Derek was placing the entire property under a total lockdown. The overseas buyers were arriving tonight for a preliminary private dinner. Derek was ensuring zero external interruptions and zero internal leaks until the ink dried on Friday morning. No one was permitted to enter or exit the grounds without explicit physical authorization from Derek himself. I was completely trapped inside a $12 million fortress surrounded by armed men who would gladly utilize lethal force to protect their employer's investment. I stepped back from the window into the damp shadows of the utility room. I had the flash drive. I knew the location of the patent. I had a lawyer ready to strike. But to execute the counterattack, I had to escape an impenetrable compound entirely undetected. I crouched on the damp concrete floor of the utility room, resting the cracked tablet on an overturned wooden crate. I had exactly 48 hours before Derek signed away $56 million and vanished with the capital. A standard phone call would be intercepted immediately. Derek undoubtedly monitored all network traffic exiting the estate routers to protect his fraudulent enterprise. I navigated to the tablet's internal developer settings. I manually configured a virtual private network protocol, routing my connection through a series of proxy servers located in Eastern Europe. I routed the signal through 3 distinct offshore servers to ensure Derek's corporate security department could not trace the origin point back to the stables. I opened the secure voice over Internet Protocol application. I typed in a 10-digit number I had committed to memory a decade ago. I pressed the call button. The line rang twice in the pitch-black room. A sharp, gravelly voice answered on the third ring. "Speak," the man demanded. "Simon," I said quietly into the device microphone. "It is Wendell. I am out." I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the encrypted line. Simon was my former chief corporate counsel and my closest confidant. When the federal agents raided our headquarters 10 years ago, Derek immediately threw Simon under the bus, blacklisting him from every major corporate firm in the state to ensure he could not mount my defense. Simon lost his prestigious partnership, his corner office, and his sterling reputation. He kept a small, rundown practice open in the industrial district for one single reason. He was waiting for my release. Wendell Simon whispered, his voice tight with restrained adrenaline. "Where are you right now?" "I am physically inside Derek's estate," I replied. "I bypassed a security device. Derek is executing a total corporate sale to an overseas buyer on Friday morning. The contract stipulates a complete liquidation of all domestic assets. He is moving the $56 million into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I have the original master source code on a physical drive. We need an emergency judicial injunction before Friday to freeze the transaction. I cannot file a federal injunction based on a stolen tablet and a flash drive," Simon stated, urgently shifting into his professional legal cadence. Derek fabricated a complete transfer of intellectual property years ago. He bribed an entire team of auditors to certify his ownership of the software algorithm. To freeze a multi-million-dollar international acquisition, I need physical possession of your original notarized software patent. Do you still have it?" "I have it," I confirmed. "But we have a severe timeline issue. Why is the board of directors allowing a total liquidation without a mandatory 90-day review period?" "Derek structured the board with his own sycophants," Simon explained, the frustration evident in his tone. "However, corporate bylaws dictate that a total liquidation requires a supermajority vote. Derek controls 4 seats. He needs 5 to bypass the review period and finalize the liquidation immediately. Wyatt holds the swing vote. That is why Derek tolerates his incompetence. Wyatt is the proxy director for your daughter's inherited shares. If Wyatt votes yes tomorrow afternoon, the sale becomes legally binding by Friday morning. We have to strip Derek of his claim to the intellectual property before the board convenes." I processed the information rapidly. Derek engineered the corporate bylaws to grant Wyatt executive voting rights over Kendra's inherited shares. By keeping Wyatt intoxicated and drowning in personal debt, Derek controlled the entire board by proxy. It was a masterclass in corporate manipulation. Wyatt was a violent drunk, but he held the key to the entire acquisition. "I cannot leverage Wyatt without leverage of my own," I said. "I will secure the patent to destroy the foundation of the sale." "A digital scan of the original document will not hold up in front of a federal judge," Simon warned. Derek's lawyers will immediately claim it is a digitally altered forgery meant to sabotage a legitimate business deal. The foreign buyers will ignore a pending investigation and sign the contract anyway to secure the asset. I need the physical paper. I need the wet ink signature and the raised notary seal. Bring the document to my office on 5th Street. We will file the injunction manually at the federal courthouse at dawn. The path forward was narrow and heavily guarded. I ended the secure call and wiped the application from the tablet's memory cache. I struck the cracked screen against the concrete floor one final time, entirely destroying the internal motherboard to prevent any forensic recovery. I tossed the ruined device into a trash bin in the corner of the utility room. I had to retrieve the patent. I stored the authentic documentation in a highly secure safe deposit box at a downtown bank facility 15 years ago. Accessing the vault presented a massive logistical hurdle. Federal banking regulations require dual authentication for physical vault entry. I had the brass key safely hidden inside the thick rubber sole of my prison boot, but my state-issued identification card expired 8 years ago while I was incarcerated. My temporary parole documentation would trigger an immediate secondary background check by the bank manager. I needed to formulate a method to bypass the rigorous identification protocol without triggering a silent alarm that would alert the authorities. I stood up from the wooden crate and brushed the thick layer of dust from my gray canvas jacket. I walked toward the small barred window at the top of the utility room wall. I peered out across the sprawling manicured lawn. The situation was escalating much faster than I anticipated. The estate was undergoing a sudden tactical transformation. 3 black, heavily armored sport utility vehicles pulled into the main driveway, blocking the primary exit paths. A dozen men stepped out of the vehicles. They did not wear standard estate security uniforms. They wore tactical dark clothing and carried high-lumen flashlights attached to heavy utility belts. These were not local security guards. They were highly trained military contractors paid exorbitant sums to ensure absolute perimeter integrity. I watched closely as Derek stepped out onto the front porch, handing a clipboard to the lead contractor. Derek pointed aggressively toward the perimeter walls and the main iron gates. The contractors moved with rigid military efficiency. They pulled thick, heavy steel chains from the back of their vehicles and began wrapping them securely around the main estate gates, securing them with massive industrial padlocks. Derek was placing the entire property under a total lockdown. The overseas buyers were arriving tonight for a preliminary private dinner in the main dining hall. Derek was ensuring 0 external interruptions and 0 internal leaks until the ink dried on the acquisition documents Friday morning. No one was permitted to enter or exit the grounds without explicit physical authorization from Derek himself. I was completely trapped inside a $12 million fortress surrounded by armed men who would gladly utilize lethal force to protect their employer's investment. I stepped back from the window into the damp shadows of the utility room. I had the flash drive in my pocket. I knew the exact location of the patent. I had a lawyer ready to strike at the federal level. But to execute the counterattack, I had to escape an impenetrable compound entirely undetected before the sun came up. The freezing November wind whipped across my face as I sprinted away from the service entrance. Behind me, the $12 million estate was plunged into absolute darkness. I heard the heavy, frantic shouts of the private military contractors echoing across the manicured lawn. Wyatt was screaming orders from the patio demanding they release the tracking dogs. I did not run blindly into the tree line. Panic is a luxury that gets a man caught. I spent 20 years walking every inch of this property before Derek stole it from me. I knew the topography better than the men currently hunting me. I slipped past the towering oak trees and immediately dropped low to the ground. The furious barking of Dobermans shattered the quiet night. High-lumen flashlights cut through the dense branches, slicing through the darkness like white blades. I pressed my back against the rough bark of a massive pine tree. 2 armed contractors jogged past my position, sweeping the underbrush with their weapons drawn. They were relying on technology and aggressive force. I relied on memory. I moved silently toward the eastern perimeter where the manicured gardens gave way to untamed wilderness. I navigated the steep incline using a series of old deer trails I mapped out decades ago when I first surveyed the land for construction. The contractors were heavy and clumsy, tripping over exposed roots and cursing loudly in the dark. I moved with the quiet, deliberate precision of a man who had spent 3,650 days surviving in a federal penitentiary. I anticipated their movements before they made them. The barking grew louder and much more frantic. The dogs had caught my scent on the wet grass near the service doors. I had a 3-minute head start, but the animals were closing the distance rapidly. I reached the edge of the property line where a steep ravine cut deeply into the earth. If I stayed on the dry land, the dogs would corner me against the perimeter wall within 60 seconds. I had to erase my biological signature completely. I scrambled down the muddy embankment, sliding past sharp rocks and thorny bushes. At the bottom of the ravine, a fast-moving creek rushed over jagged stones. I did not hesitate. I plunged directly into the freezing water. The brutal cold shocked my system, instantly soaking through my gray canvas groundskeeper uniform. The icy current gripped my legs, threatening to pull me under, but I maintained my balance. I waded waist-deep into the center of the creek, moving swiftly downstream. I forced myself to walk through the freezing water for half a mile. The physical pain was excruciating, but the tactical advantage was absolute. The freezing water washed away my sweat and masked my scent trail entirely. I heard the dogs reach the top of the embankment behind me. They paced frantically along the muddy ridge, barking in aggressive confusion. They had lost the trail. The contractors yelled commands at the animals, but the pursuit was broken. I pushed forward against the current until the sounds of the dogs faded into the background. I dragged my soaking wet body out of the water and collapsed onto the muddy bank. My muscles cramped violently from the extreme cold. I forced myself to stand up. I climbed the steep ridge, pushing through a dense thicket of overgrown brambles. The glowing amber lights of the interstate highway appeared through the trees. I broke through the final line of brush and stepped onto the wet asphalt shoulder. I shivered uncontrollably in the freezing rain. I needed transportation immediately. Walking into the city in a soaking wet uniform would attract unwanted police attention and trigger a devastating parole violation. A pair of bright headlights crested the hill. A commercial delivery truck roared down the empty highway. I stepped directly into the right lane, waving my arms aggressively. The air brakes hissed loudly as the heavy truck skidded to a halt mere feet away from me. The driver rolled down his window, glaring at me through the driving rain. He took one look at my shivering frame and the desperation in my eyes. I pulled a crumpled $50 bill from my pocket. It was part of the emergency cash I hid inside my shoe 10 years ago. I handed the wet bill to the driver. He did not ask questions. He unlocked the passenger door and motioned for me to get inside. The heater blasted warm air against my freezing skin as the truck accelerated toward the city center. I survived the hunt, but the clock was still ticking. The delivery truck dropped me off 2 blocks away from the downtown financial district just as the sun began to rise over the city skyline. I walked briskly toward the towering glass and steel facade of the First National Bank. My clothes were still damp, but the morning commuter rush allowed me to blend into the busy crowd. I pulled the hood of my jacket up to obscure my face from the street cameras. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors exactly as the bank opened for business. The lobby was pristine and quiet. I bypassed the standard teller lines and walked directly toward the secure subterranean vault facility. A polished mahogany desk sat in front of the reinforced steel vault doors. The vault manager, a young man in a sharp-tailored suit, looked up from his computer monitor as I approached. "Good morning, sir," he said with practiced corporate politeness. "How can I assist you today?" "I need immediate access to secure box 412, I stated firmly, keeping my voice low. The manager requested my identification. I reached into my pocket and handed him my temporary state-issued parole document. The manager frowned slightly at the coarse paper but swiped the barcode under his optical scanner. He typed my name into his secure terminal. I watched his fingers move across the keyboard. The professional smile vanished from his face instantly. He stared at the screen and then looked back at me with a hardened expression. "I cannot grant you access to the vault, Mr. Harper," he said, sliding my identification paper back across the desk. "Your security permissions were legally revoked." I placed my hands flat on the mahogany wood. "I am the sole owner of box 412, I replied. "The intellectual property inside that box belongs entirely to me." That was true until 2 years ago. The manager countered his tone, turning defensive. "A formal court order was filed by your wife, Yvonne Harper. She executed a full transfer of asset management due to your federal incarceration. You have zero legal authority over the contents of that box. I am going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately, or I will trigger the silent alarm and summon the police." I stared at the man. My own wife had legally locked me out of my foundational assets while I was rotting in a cell. The $56 million acquisition would proceed tomorrow morning, and the only document capable of stopping Derek was sitting 50 feet away behind a wall of impenetrable steel. The vault manager kept his hand hovering directly over the red emergency panic button mounted beneath his polished mahogany desk. His eyes darted nervously between my damp canvas jacket and the computer monitor displaying my revoked security clearance. He was a young professional trained to identify risk and mitigate liability. A shivering 68-year-old man smelling of river water and presenting a temporary state-issued parole document registered as an immediate catastrophic threat. I watched his index finger twitch toward the alarm. Pressing that button would instantly lock down the entire financial facility and summon an armed response unit from the local precinct. A police interaction would result in my immediate detention for violating the terms of my release. I would be locked in a holding cell while Derek finalized the $56 million liquidation of my life work. I needed to de-escalate the situation without drawing the attention of the armed security guard standing near the main entrance. I kept my hands perfectly still and flat against the edge of the mahogany desk. I took a slow, measured breath to steady my shivering core. I focused my attention entirely on the young manager. I needed an angle of leverage. I needed a vulnerability. I scanned his perfectly pressed suit and his crisp silk tie. My eyes locked onto the small brushed brass nameplate pinned meticulously to his left lapel. It read Colin Reed in sharp black lettering. I stared at the name for 3 critical seconds. My mind raced backward through decades of corporate philanthropy and private financial records. I had an eidetic memory for numbers and investments. I managed thousands of accounts before Derek orchestrated my federal indictment. The name Colin Reed triggered an immediate, deeply buried file in my mental archive. I remembered a specific charitable trust I established 15 years ago through a blind proxy firm. I remembered the exact socioeconomic parameters I set for the disbursements. I remembered the specific recipient file that crossed my desk detailing a young high school senior facing absolute ruin due to massive family medical debt. I looked directly into the manager's anxious eyes. I did not move my hands. I lowered my voice to a calm, authoritative register. "Colin," I said evenly, "move your hand away from the silent alarm. You do not want to call the armed authorities on me." Colin tensed his jaw, but his finger hesitated above the button. "I am performing my mandated security protocols, Mr. Harper," he replied, his voice shaking slightly. "The court order filed by your wife is absolute. You have zero legal jurisdiction over the contents of the vault. I am giving you one final warning to vacate the lobby. 15 years ago, your mother underwent aggressive experimental chemotherapy for stage 3 lung cancer." I stated, my voice cutting through his rehearsed corporate dialogue. "The medical bills completely drained your family savings. You were valedictorian of your high school class, but you were preparing to drop out and take a minimum wage job to prevent a bank from foreclosing on your childhood home." Colin froze completely. The color vanished from his cheeks. His hand dropped slowly away from the underside of the desk. "How do you know that?" he whispered, his eyes wide with sudden shock. "In August of that year, an anonymous educational trust deposited $42,500 directly into the State University bursar account." I continued, never breaking eye contact. "The routing code for that specific wire transfer ended in 884219. The funds covered your tuition, your housing, and your specialized textbooks for a degree in financial management. A secondary anonymous transfer of $30,000 settled your mother's hospital lien entirely. You never knew the name of your benefactor because I specifically instructed my proxy attorneys to seal the disbursement records." The air in the lobby felt heavy and utterly still. Colin stared at my damp prison boots and my coarse canvas jacket, trying to reconcile the image of a convicted paroled felon with the invisible savior who altered the trajectory of his entire life. "You," he stammered, gripping the edge of the desk. "You were the founder of the Horizon Educational Trust." "I am the sole financier of that trust," I confirmed. "I built my logistics empire to ensure men like you did not lose their futures to circumstances beyond their control. Derek stole that empire while I served 10 years for his fraud. The man who orchestrated my downfall is currently finalizing the sale of my stolen company. He intends to liquidate everything and erase my legacy. The only document capable of halting that illegal $56 million transaction is sitting inside safe deposit box number 412. Colin looked down at the glowing computer screen displaying my permanent revocation of access. He looked across the lobby at the armed security guard standing by the revolving doors. A fierce internal conflict played out across his face. He was weighing his prestigious career and his banking license against a profound, unpaid debt of gratitude. He reached deeply into his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy physical master key attached to a steel lanyard. He bypassed the digital prompt on his terminal, striking a rapid series of override commands on his keyboard. The screen flashed green, indicating a temporary manual suspension of the biometric protocols. "Follow me," he instructed, his voice dropping to a rapid, urgent whisper. "You have exactly 5 minutes before the central system logs the manual override and alerts the regional branch director." Colin stood up and walked briskly toward the massive titanium vault doors. I followed him closely, my wet boots squeaking softly against the polished marble floor. He inserted the master key into the primary cylinder and engaged the heavy mechanical lever. The thick steel door hissed loudly as the internal vacuum seal broke. We stepped into the freezing climate-controlled interior of the vault. I walked directly down the third aisle to box number 412. I pulled the small brass key I had kept hidden inside the sole of my shoe for an entire decade. I inserted the key into the secondary lock while Colin engaged the primary tumbler. The heavy metal drawer slid outward smoothly. I reached inside and retrieved a thick, sealed, waterproof envelope. I tore the top open and felt the heavy parchment paper inside. My fingers brushed against the raised metallic notary seal. It was the authentic original software patent proving my absolute intellectual ownership of the foundational corporate algorithm. I shoved the envelope deep into the interior pocket of my damp canvas jacket. We exited the vault rapidly. Colin locked the massive steel doors behind us and returned to his mahogany desk, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Our debt is permanently settled, Mr. Harper," he said quietly, turning his computer monitor off. I nodded my thanks and turned toward the main lobby doors. My blood turned to ice instantly. 3 men in tactical dark suits pushed violently through the revolving doors. Derek's private enforcers had tracked my digital footprint to the bank. The 3 enforcers fanned out across the polished marble floor of the bank lobby. They wore matching charcoal suits that barely concealed the heavy tactical holsters resting at their waists. The lead enforcer locked eyes with the armed security guard near the entrance, flashing a laminated private investigator badge that gave them a thin veil of legal authority to hunt me. I was standing 50 feet away near the vault corridor, my gray canvas jacket dripping freezing river water onto the immaculate floor. I had exactly 5 seconds before their sweeping gaze reached my position. I did not run toward the main doors. Running immediately triggers a predator's pursuit instinct. I backed slowly into the deep shadow of a marble structural pillar. Mounted directly on the wall behind the pillar was a bright red emergency fire alarm station. I raised my fist and smashed the protective glass casing with the thick, heavy heel of my palm. I grabbed the white lever and pulled it downward with all my weight. The deafening screech of the industrial alarm sirens shattered the quiet morning atmosphere of the financial institution. Blinding white strobe lights flashed aggressively from the ceiling. A second later, the automated fire suppression system engaged entirely. High-pressure sprinkler heads ruptured, sending a torrential downpour of cold water over the entire lobby. Absolute chaos erupted instantly. Dozens of morning commuters and bank employees screamed in sudden panic. The crowd surged violently toward the main revolving doors in a desperate stampede to escape the building. A wall of terrified bodies crashed directly into Derek's enforcers, pinning them helplessly against the glass facade. I did not watch them struggle. I turned my back to the lobby and slipped seamlessly through a restricted wooden door marked for authorized personnel only. I navigated the narrow fluorescent-lit hallway, pushing past bewildered bank tellers rushing in the opposite direction. I located the employee break room at the end of the corridor. The room smelled of stale coffee and burnt toast. I crossed the linoleum floor in 3 long strides and hit the heavy steel crash bar of the rear emergency exit. The metal door slammed open, spilling me out into a narrow, trash-filled alleyway. The air outside was freezing, biting through my wet clothing, but I was finally out of the immediate trap. I sprinted down the damp cobblestone alley, jumping over discarded wooden pallets and overflowing garbage bins. I did not slow down until the screaming sirens faded completely into the distance. I emerged from the alleyway 2 blocks away, merging smoothly into the heavy pedestrian foot traffic on the city sidewalk. Police sirens wailed loudly in the distance, converging rapidly on the bank I had just evacuated. I kept my head down, pulling the collar of my wet jacket high around my neck to obscure my face from the municipal surveillance cameras mounted on the streetlights. I needed to put miles between myself and the financial district immediately, but my temporary parole identification was useless for purchasing a digital transit ticket. I descended the concrete stairs of a crowded subway station. The air below ground was warm and smelled heavily of ozone and hot iron. I stepped into a secluded corner near a broken ticket kiosk. I knelt down and unlaced my heavy left prison boot. I pulled out the worn orthotic insole. Flattened perfectly against the rubber base was a crisp $100 bill. 10 years ago, right before I surrendered to the federal marshals, I slipped that single bill into my shoe. Through countless cell inspections, strip searches, and transfers, I had successfully guarded this specific piece of currency for an entire decade. I fed the bill into an automated transit machine, purchased a reusable fare card, and securely pocketed the remaining crumpled change. I boarded a northbound train just as the heavy metal doors slid shut with a mechanical thud. I sat in the isolated corner seat, watching the dark tunnel walls flash past the scratched window. My clothes clung uncomfortably to my skin, but my focus remained completely sharp. I rode the transit system for 45 minutes, transferring twice to completely sever any potential tracking routes Derek's men might attempt to establish. I exited the subway network deep in the industrial sector of the city. The towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district were replaced by rusted manufacturing plants and towering chain-link fences. I walked 3 blocks down a cracked sidewalk until I saw the flickering neon sign of a rundown diner on 5th Street. I pushed open the greasy glass door. The diner was nearly empty, occupied only by exhausted warehouse shift workers. I walked straight to a cracked vinyl booth in the darkest corner of the back room. Simon sat waiting for me. My former chief corporate counsel wore a faded tweed suit, nursing a cup of black coffee. He looked up as I slid into the booth opposite him. I reached inside my wet jacket, pulled out the thick sealed envelope from the bank vault, and dropped it firmly onto the scratched Formica table. Simon did not say a word. He carefully tore open the top of the envelope and extracted the heavy parchment documents. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and scrutinized the pages under the dim amber light hanging above the diner booth. I watched his eyes scan the intricate legal phrasing, the authorized signatures, and the raised metallic notary seal stamped firmly at the bottom of the final page. He ran his thumb over the wet ink signature I had signed over 15 years ago. "It is completely authentic," Simon whispered, letting out a long, deep breath of sheer relief. "This is the absolute foundation of your logistics empire. You own the algorithm outright." "Then we file the emergency federal injunction immediately," I stated, leaning forward. "We freeze the corporate accounts today and halt the buyout before the Asian conglomerate wires the $56 million tomorrow morning." Simon slowly lowered the document, removing his reading glasses with a heavy sigh. "We cannot file it today, Wendell." Derek anticipated this exact scenario. When he dissolved your shares 10 years ago, he did not just take the company. He filed a secondary legal addendum deep within the corporate registry. He fabricated a backdated transfer of intellectual property, falsely claiming you signed over the algorithm rights to a holding company he controls entirely. I stared at Simon. Derek forged my signature on an intellectual property transfer while I was sitting in a maximum security cell. If I walk into a federal courthouse with this patent, Derek's legal team will produce the forged transfer agreement, Simon explained grimly. They will bury us in endless procedural motions and aggressive countersuits. The judge will order a lengthy forensic investigation into the signatures to determine actual ownership. That review process takes months. The overseas buyers are not going to wait for a domestic legal battle. They will sign the acquisition contract tomorrow morning, transfer the capital offshore, and Derek will vanish long before the court reaches a verdict. A piece of paper cannot stop this sale, Wendell. We need human testimony. We need a current standing member of the board of directors to go on the record tomorrow morning and swear under oath that Derek forged the transfer documents. I processed the devastating legal loophole. Derek had built a nearly impenetrable corporate shield around his massive fraud. He populated the board with loyalists who profited directly from his theft. There was no one inside the boardroom who would willingly turn on him except for one highly unstable vulnerability. "I need to track down Wyatt," I said firmly. "Wyatt controls my daughter's voting proxy. He is a terrified man drowning in hidden debt, currently embezzling corporate funds to survive. He is the absolute weakest link in Derek's armor, and I am going to break him tonight." I left Simon sitting in the rundown diner and stepped back into the freezing city night. I did not have time to rest. I had the raw financial data from Wyatt's cracked corporate tablet committed entirely to my eidetic memory. I knew exactly where my son-in-law spent his Thursday nights. I navigated the transit system back toward the deep industrial sector. The towering glass structures of the financial district faded into rows of decaying brick buildings and rusted chain-link fences. I approached an abandoned commercial shipping warehouse positioned at the dead end of a cracked asphalt road. There were no exterior lights. The heavy rolling steel doors were padlocked shut with thick industrial chains. However, a steady line of luxury vehicles sat parked discreetly in the narrow alleyway behind the structure. I walked silently past a heavily customized Mercedes and approached a reinforced steel side door. A massive security guard in a tailored suit stood on the loading dock smoking a cigarette. I did not engage him. I slipped behind a row of overflowing industrial dumpsters and scaled a rusted fire escape ladder leading to a second-story ventilation grate. 10 years in a federal cell required me to maintain a rigorous physical discipline just to survive the daily violence of the yard. I pulled the heavy iron grate loose and slipped inside the dark ventilation shaft. I crawled silently over the active warehouse floor. I peered through the metal slats directly into the hidden subterranean level below. The expansive room was converted into a high-stakes illegal poker club. Thick cigar smoke hung heavily under the bright hanging lights. I scanned the crowded room and located my target immediately. Wyatt sat at a high-stakes table near the back wall. His expensive cashmere sweater was wrinkled. His face was slick with a heavy layer of nervous sweat. He stared at his cards with the frantic, desperate intensity of a man drowning in a rapidly sinking ship. He pushed a massive stack of high-denomination casino chips into the center of the table. He was betting wildly, trying to chase his astronomical losses. The dealer revealed the final card. The man sitting across from Wyatt smiled coldly and laid down a winning hand. Wyatt slammed his fists against the green felt table. He just lost a fortune he did not legally possess. Wyatt stood up abruptly, knocking his wooden chair backward onto the concrete floor. He stumbled away from the table, wiping a trembling hand across his pale face. I knew exactly whose money he was throwing away. The offshore routing numbers I decrypted on the tablet proved Wyatt was systematically embezzling operating capital from the logistics company. Derek manipulated the corporate bylaws to grant Wyatt board voting rights, but Derek was too arrogant to monitor his son-in-law's private accounts. Wyatt was skimming hundreds of thousands of dollars to feed a crippling gambling addiction. But the well had finally run completely dry. Derek had frozen the corporate accounts in preparation for the $56 million liquidation sale tomorrow morning. Wyatt was entirely cut off from his stolen funds. I watched from the ventilation grate as Wyatt practically ran toward the rear exit of the warehouse. He pushed through the heavy steel doors and included parking lot. I moved quickly, reversing my path through the ventilation shaft. I dropped down from the fire escape landing silently on the wet asphalt just as Wyatt reached the driver's side door of his bright red sports car. He fumbled frantically with his keys, dropping them onto the wet pavement. He bent down to retrieve them. 3 large men stepped out from the deep shadows of a parked delivery van. They wore dark leather jackets and moved with the synchronized predatory grace of professional syndicate enforcers. The lead enforcer, a man with a thick scar running down his jawline, stepped directly into Wyatt's personal space. "You are leaving the table early, Wyatt," the enforcer growled, his voice echoing off the brick walls. "You owe our boss $250,000. The deadline was midnight. Wyatt pressed his back against the side of his car, holding his hands up defensively. "I just need 24 hours, he pleaded, his voice cracking with pure terror. "The company is finalizing a massive merger tomorrow morning. I will have your money by tomorrow afternoon. I swear." The enforcer shook his head slowly. "Your corporate credit lines declined an hour ago, Wyatt. You are broke. You pay the balance right now, or we break both of your legs and take the car as a down payment." The 2 men behind him stepped forward, pulling heavy-weighted batons from their jackets. Wyatt whimpered, sliding down the side of his car in absolute panic. I stepped out from the shadows of the fire escape. I bent down and picked up a heavy, rusted steel plumbing pipe resting near a stack of wooden pallets. The metal felt cold and perfectly balanced in my right hand. I walked deliberately into the center of the parking lot. The sudden sound of my boots on the wet gravel drew the attention of the enforcers. The lead man turned toward me, his hand reaching instinctively into his leather jacket. I did not give him time to draw a weapon. I swung the steel pipe in a brutal horizontal arc, striking the lead enforcer cleanly behind his left knee. The man collapsed instantly with a sharp, agonizing cry, holding his shattered joint. The second enforcer lunged forward, raising his weighted baton. I sidestepped his heavy, clumsy swing, using his forward momentum against him. I drove the heavy steel pipe directly upward into his ribcage and followed with a swift, crushing strike to his jaw. He dropped to the wet asphalt, completely incapacitated. The third man stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at his 2 broken partners groaning on the ground. He looked at my cold expression and the steel pipe resting firmly in my hand. He slowly raised his empty hands, backed away cautiously, and dragged his conscious partner toward their dark van. The vehicle sped out of the alleyway, tires screeching against the wet pavement. I dropped the steel pipe. The loud metallic clatter made Wyatt flinch violently. He stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief and horror. I walked over to him and stood inches from his face. "You are stealing from Derek to pay a violent syndicate," I stated coldly. "I have the digital ledgers. I have the routing numbers proving you skimmed their payouts to cover your own tracks." Wyatt trembled uncontrollably, pressing himself against the cold metal of his car door. "You testify against Derek in front of a federal judge tomorrow morning," I commanded. "You formally vote down the $56 million acquisition. If you refuse, I will hand the unredacted digital ledger directly to the syndicate boss. They will realize you have been stealing from them. They will not stop at breaking your legs." Wyatt swallowed hard, a tear of absolute terror running down his face. "I will testify," he stammered, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. "I swear, I will vote against the sale. Just do not give them the ledger." I turned my back on him and walked away into the dark alley. I did not look back. Before I reached the end of the block, I heard the distinct beep of a cell phone keypad. Wyatt was frantically whispering into his device. He was calling Derek. My cowardly son-in-law had betrayed my exact location the moment I walked away. I kept my pace steady as I walked away from the industrial warehouse district. Wyatt was still on the phone, with Derek feeding my location to the man who ruined my life. I did not run. Running draws the attention of passing patrol cars. I navigated the maze of chain-link fences and cracked sidewalks until I reached a busy commercial avenue. I flagged down a passing city bus, paying with the loose change I had left over from my subway ride. I rode the bus for 6 miles, transferring at a busy terminal to a westbound line that headed toward the city limits. I had to assume Derek was tracking my movements through municipal cameras or paying informants on the street. I finally stepped off the bus near a dilapidated strip mall. 2 blocks away stood the Starlight Motor Inn. It was a decaying single-story motel with a flickering neon sign that buzzed loudly in the freezing rain. I paid for room 12 entirely in cash 3 days ago using a fake name. It was supposed to be my invisible sanctuary. I walked through the dark parking lot, keeping my head down and avoiding the dim glow of the exterior floodlights. I approached the concrete walkway leading to my room. I stopped exactly 10 feet away from the heavy wooden door. 10 years in a federal maximum security facility fundamentally alters your perception of safety. You learn to read the microscopic details of your environment to survive the daily violence of the cell block. I looked at the base of the door. When I left this morning, I deliberately kicked a small pile of gray gravel against the bottom edge of the weather stripping. The gravel was completely scattered across the concrete. Someone had opened the door while I was gone. I shifted my gaze upward to the brass hinges. The metal was dull and oxidized, but a fresh, bright scratch gleamed near the center pin. Someone had forcefully bypassed the cheap mechanical lock with a specialized pry bar. I did not reach into my pocket for my brass key. I did not take another step forward toward the entrance. I slowly backed away into the deep shadows of a broken ice machine. I retreated silently across the wet asphalt of the motel parking lot. I crossed the dark 2-lane street and crouched behind a row of rusted commuter vehicles parked in front of a closed laundromat. The freezing rain continued to fall heavily, masking the sound of my breathing and the steady crunch of my boots on the pavement. I waited in the absolute darkness, my eyes fixed on the door to room 12. 10 minutes later, 3 unmarked black sedans rolled into the motel parking lot with their headlights completely extinguished. They parked at sharp tactical angles, blocking any potential escape routes from the courtyard. 6 heavily armed tactical police officers stepped out of the vehicles. They wore thick ballistic vests and carried heavy breaching equipment. They moved with aggressive military precision. The lead officer swung a heavy steel battering ram directly into the center of my motel room door. The wood splintered violently, and the door crashed inward off its hinges with a deafening crack. The officers flooded the tiny room, shouting aggressive commands into the empty space. I watched from across the street as the interior lights snapped on. 5 minutes later, the lead officer emerged from the room holding a large black canvas duffel bag. He unzipped the top and pulled out a thick, clear plastic brick filled with white powder. He shined his heavy tactical flashlight directly onto the illegal narcotics. The trap was masterfully orchestrated. Derek knew he could not simply murder me without drawing intense federal scrutiny, especially with Simon actively filing legal inquiries on my behalf. Instead, Derek chose a far more permanent and legally binding execution. He planted a massive quantity of synthetic narcotics inside my registered room and tipped off the local narcotics task force. Being caught with a distribution-level quantity of illegal drugs while on federal parole carried a mandatory life sentence. I would die in a concrete cell, completely discredited, while Derek finalized the sale of my logistics empire. I watched the police officers radio for a crime scene unit. My temporary sanctuary was now an active crime scene. The authorities would find my fingerprints on the bathroom sink and my DNA on the cheap bed sheets. Within the hour, a citywide manhunt would be issued for my immediate arrest. I was no longer just a paroled corporate felon. I was a highly dangerous wanted fugitive. The walls were closing in with terrifying speed. I slowly backed away from the parked cars and slipped into a narrow pedestrian alleyway. The freezing rain soaked through the heavy canvas of my jacket, chilling my bones, but my mind raced with extreme clarity. My original tactical plan was entirely compromised. I could no longer rely on Wyatt to testify against Derek in front of a federal judge tomorrow morning. Wyatt was too terrified of the gambling syndicate and far too subservient to Derek's corporate power. He chose to betray my location to save his own life and protect his fragile status within the company. The moment the police issued the arrest warrant, Simon would be legally barred from filing the emergency injunction on my behalf. Any document I submitted to the court would be immediately dismissed as the desperate fabrication of a fleeing narcotics distributor. Derek had successfully neutralized my legal counterattack without ever stepping foot inside a courtroom. The Asian logistics conglomerate would arrive at the corporate headquarters at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to sign the $56 million acquisition contract. I had less than 10 hours to dismantle a massive corporate fortress while actively hunted by every police officer in the city. I needed an internal mechanism to halt the sale from the inside. I needed the one person on the estate who held legitimate foundational authority over the company's shares. I had to confront my daughter. Kendra despised me. She believed every lie Derek fed her for a decade. She viewed me as the monster who ruined her life and bankrupted her future. Approaching her directly was an astronomical risk. If she screamed or alerted Derek's private military contractors, I would be detained and handed directly to the police. But I had no other options left on the board. I had the unredacted digital ledgers downloaded from Wyatt's tablet firmly memorized. I had the physical offshore routing numbers that proved Wyatt was actively embezzling her inheritance to pay his syndicate debts. I had the undeniable proof that Derek framed me and was preparing to abandon her with a hollow corporate shell once the sale cleared. I had to break back into the $12 million estate. I had to corner my only child and force her to look at the devastating truth before the sun came up. I pulled my wet collar high around my neck and began the long, dangerous walk back to the lion's den. I moved through the freezing rain, keeping to the deepest shadows of the tree line as I approached the perimeter of my estate. The military contractors Derek hired were heavily armed and actively patrolling the main gates, but they relied too heavily on their thermal scopes. They did not know about the subterranean drainage culvert I installed 20 years ago to prevent the lower gardens from flooding. I slipped through the rusted iron grate and crawled through the narrow concrete pipe, emerging completely undetected behind the main guest house. I stayed low, navigating the wet, manicured hedges until I reached the eastern wing of the manor. Kendra's private art studio was located on the second floor, positioned directly above the terrace. I gripped the thick climbing vines entwined around the stone trellis. My muscles burned from exhaustion and the freezing cold, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins pushed me upward. I hoisted myself onto the narrow stone balcony. The heavy glass doors leading into the studio were unlocked. I pushed them open silently and stepped inside. The room smelled strongly of oil paint and turpentine. Kendra was sitting at her drafting table. She was not painting. She was staring blankly at a canvas, a half-empty glass of wine resting near her elbow. She spun around at the sudden draft of cold air. Her eyes widened in absolute terror as my soaking wet frame stepped out of the shadows. She gasped immediately, lunging across the desk to grab her mobile phone. I moved faster. I crossed the room in 3 long strides, snatched the phone from the desk and shoved it into my jacket pocket. I planted my back firmly against the heavy oak door leading to the main hallway, completely blocking her only exit. Kendra backed away, knocking a tray of brushes onto the hardwood floor. "Get away from me," she whispered, her voice shaking with panic. "The police are looking everywhere for you. Derek told us you are armed and dangerous." I did not move. I did not raise my voice. "I am dangerous to Derek," I replied calmly. "I am not dangerous to you. You are going to sit down, Kendra. You are going to look at exactly what your husband and your stepfather have been hiding from you for a decade." I reached into the interior pocket of my damp canvas jacket. Before leaving the diner, I had Simon print the exact financial routing codes and offshore transfer logs I extracted from Wyatt's cracked tablet. I pulled the thick stack of folded papers from my pocket and slammed them down onto the center of her drafting table. The loud slap of paper hitting the wood made her flinch. I pointed a steady finger at the top document. "Read the highlighted columns," I commanded. "Do not look at me. Look at the numbers." Kendra stared at the stack of papers as if they were covered in poison. She wrapped her arms around herself, trembling slightly, but her eyes slowly drifted down to the top page. "Those are the master accounting logs for the logistics company from 10 years ago," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly clinical. "Look at the authorized transfer signatures. Derek did not save the company from bankruptcy. He intentionally drained the operating capital into a private shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. He fabricated the shipping manifest, triggered the federal audit, and framed me for the missing funds so he could steal my equity." Kendra shook her head aggressively, refusing to process the information. "You are lying," she stammered. "Derek paid the lawyers. He protected my inheritance when the government seized our accounts." I pulled the first page away, revealing the second document beneath it. "Look at the current internal corporate ledgers," I instructed. "Look at the secondary offshore accounts transferring capital out of your blind trust over the last 6 months." Kendra leaned forward, her eyes scanning the rows of recent financial transactions. Her breathing hitched. The accounts listed were not corporate vendor payouts. They were massive, untraceable wire transfers bleeding the company dry just hours before the scheduled acquisition. That is Wyatt, I stated firmly. Your husband is systematically embezzling your inherited shares to pay off a violent, illegal gambling syndicate in the industrial district. He is drowning in debt. The bruise on your wrist is not a clumsy accident. It is the desperate aggression of a man who knows his financial lifeline is about to be completely severed. Derek is selling the company tomorrow morning. He is liquidating all domestic assets. Once the foreign buyers sign that contract, Derek will vanish with the capital and Wyatt will leave you holding the empty, debt-ridden corporate shell. Kendra gripped the edge of the drafting table. She stared at the specific alphanumeric routing codes printed on the embezzlement records. Her face turned a sickly shade of pale. She recognized the sequence immediately. It was the exact offshore account number Wyatt used to shield his personal assets when they filed their joint tax returns last year. The undeniable mathematical proof shattered the fabricated reality she had lived in for 3,650 days. The men she believed were her saviors were actually the architects of her absolute destruction. Derek had orchestrated her father's imprisonment, and Wyatt was actively stealing her future to survive his own pathetic vices. A single tear broke free and rolled down her cheek, followed immediately by a heavy, devastating sob. She fell back into her chair, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. The entire foundation of her life collapsed in mere seconds. She looked up at me. The hatred in her eyes was completely gone, replaced by a profound, agonizing realization of my innocence and my immense sacrifice. I took a step forward to comfort my daughter, but the heavy brass handle of the studio door suddenly turned. I shifted my weight, instantly preparing for a violent confrontation with the security contractors. The door swung inward. Yvonne walked into the studio holding an empty wine glass. My wife stopped dead in her tracks. She wore an immaculate silk nightgown, her hair perfectly styled even in the middle of the night. She stared at my damp, dirt-covered clothes and then looked at the printed financial ledgers spread across her daughter's desk. Her eyes widened in sheer panic. She opened her mouth, inhaling deeply to scream for the armed guards patrolling the hallway. I closed the distance between us in a fraction of a second. I stepped directly into her personal space, trapping her between the heavy oak door and the edge of the drafting table. Scream. Yvonne, I said coldly, keeping my voice barely above a lethal whisper. Scream for Derek's men. But before you do, look at the documents on that desk. Look at the absolute financial ruin your new husband is about to leave you with when he boards a private jet to Europe tomorrow afternoon. Yvonne froze entirely, her breath catching in her throat as she looked at the undeniable evidence of her impending destitution. Yvonne swallowed hard, the sharp intake of breath dying completely in her throat. She stood trapped between the heavy oak door and the edge of the drafting table, the empty crystal wine glass shaking violently in her manicured hand. Her eyes darted from my damp canvas jacket to the heavily highlighted financial documents spread across the wood. She tried to maintain her aristocratic posture, lifting her chin to project a false sense of authority. She opened her mouth, preparing to call out for the armed tactical contractors patrolling the eastern wing hallway. I did not step back. I leaned forward, letting my physical presence dominate the narrow space. Call them Yvonne, I stated, my voice a flat, unwavering monotone. Summon the men paid by the exact same accounts Derek is currently draining. Let them drag me out of here. But understand that the moment I leave this room, the federal injunction files automatically. The offshore transfers freeze, and Derek will realize someone tipped off the authorities. He will need a scapegoat for the missing capital. Who do you think he will blame when the federal marshals surround this estate tomorrow afternoon? Yvonne snapped her mouth shut. The crystal glass slipped from her fingers, shattering into dozens of sharp fragments against the hardwood floor. She looked at Kendra, who sat completely paralyzed in her chair, tears streaming down her pale face. Yvonne looked back at me, the polished facade of the wealthy socialite crumbling into raw, desperate panic. You are lying, Yvonne whispered, her voice cracking. Derek saved us. He shielded my assets when the government raided your accounts. I reached past her and tapped a single ink-stained finger directly onto the master accounting log. Look at the authorized transfer signatures from 2014, I commanded. He did not save your assets. He transferred my equity into a blind trust and left me holding the federal indictment. You knew the shipping manifests were falsified by his department. You knew I was innocent. Yvonne closed her eyes. A heavy, ragged sigh escaped her lungs. I knew she confessed, her voice dropping to a harsh, bitter whisper. I saw the secondary ledgers in his briefcase 3 weeks before the raid. I knew he was skimming the logistics capital. I knew he engineered the federal audit to force you out of the company. I stared at the woman I had loved for 30 years. I felt absolutely no anger, only a profound, chilling disgust. You sent me to a maximum security cell for a decade, I said quietly. You let your only daughter believe her father was a greedy criminal. You watched me take the fall to protect this family knowing the true architect of the fraud was sleeping in your guest room. Why? Yvonne opened her eyes. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, ruthless pragmatism. Because you were a fool, Wendell, she spat, her tone hardening with defensive venom. You built a $56 million logistics empire and you wanted to reinvest every single penny into employee benefits and infrastructure. You wanted to live in a modest house. You despised the country club. You despised the social elite. Derek understood how to wield wealth. He promised me the estate. He promised me a life where I did not have to pretend to be a humble working-class wife. I made a calculated choice to survive. I chose the man who offered me the world over the man who wanted to build warehouses. You lost. Take your minimum wage parole job and walk away before you ruin what little we have left. She pointed a trembling finger toward the balcony doors. I did not move. I looked at the offshore transfer logs. You do not have anything left, Yvonne, I replied, dealing the final devastating blow. Derek is signing a total liquidation contract with an Asian conglomerate at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. He is selling the entire corporate entity and transferring the $56 million payout into untraceable Cayman accounts. The massive private loans Derek and Wyatt took out to fund your luxury lifestyle are secured directly against this estate and the domestic corporate shell. When the foreign buyers take control of the intellectual property, Derek will board a private jet. He will leave you legally tied to a bankrupt domestic entity holding $4 million in fraudulent debt. You are not his partner. You are his human shield. The federal agents and the violent syndicate enforcers will seize this house and you will face the absolute ruin you thought you escaped 10 years ago. Yvonne stared at the highlighted routing numbers on the desk. The brutal reality of her impending destitution crashed over her. Derek was abandoning her to face federal prison and violent creditors. Her eyes darted wildly around the studio, searching for an exit, searching for a lifeline. Her gaze locked onto the thick, sealed, waterproof envelope protruding slightly from the interior pocket of my canvas jacket. She knew exactly what I retrieved from the bank vault. She knew the original notarized software patent was the only document capable of halting the overseas acquisition. If she possessed the authentic patent, she could blackmail Derek for a massive cut of the offshore funds before he fled the country. Desperation completely erased her refined demeanor. Yvonne lunged forward like a cornered animal. She clawed frantically at my chest, her manicured nails tearing into the heavy canvas fabric, trying to rip the envelope from my pocket. "Give it to me," she shrieked, abandoning any concern for the armed guards patrolling the estate. "I need that patent. I will not let you destroy my life again." I raised my forearm, easily blocking her frantic strikes, but I did not strike back. A physical assault would guarantee my return to a cell. Suddenly, a violent force slammed into Yvonne's shoulder. Kendra surged upward from her drafting chair. She shoved her mother backward with tremendous force. Yvonne stumbled over the shattered glass on the floor and crashed hard against the edge of the heavy wooden desk. "Do not touch him," Kendra hissed. Her voice was unrecognizable. It was devoid of fear and filled with lethal, absolute clarity. "You sold my father to a federal prison so you could wear a diamond necklace. You let Wyatt drain my inheritance to pay illegal gambling debts. You are disgusting." Yvonne touched her bruised side, staring at her daughter in pure shock. Kendra did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. She grabbed her leather purse from the chair and pulled out her electronic car keys. "We have exactly 10 hours before the overseas buyers sign the liquidation contract," Kendra said, turning to look directly at me. "The corporate servers require dual executive authorization to initiate a hard network lockdown. Wyatt controls my proxy, but my biometric access card is still active in the main lobby system. We can freeze the financial transfer protocol from the inside. We are leaving right now." We stepped over the broken glass and left Yvonne sitting alone in the dark studio. We had a $56 million empire to reclaim. The rain had stopped, but the gray dawn offered no warmth. Kendra drove her sports car with reckless precision, weaving through the early morning city traffic. The towering glass and steel monolith of the logistics headquarters loomed ahead. It was a fortress I designed 2 decades ago. Today it was the site of my ultimate theft. We parked 3 blocks away in a subterranean municipal garage. We could not risk the main executive parking level. Derek undoubtedly flagged her license plates the moment Yvonne called him from the estate. We approached the corporate plaza on foot. I pulled the collar of my damp canvas jacket high. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the main lobby, I saw the threat. The standard corporate security guards were gone. In their place stood the same dark-suited tactical military contractors Derek hired to lock down the estate. They controlled the turnstiles. They monitored the elevators. Derek was taking zero chances while the overseas buyers sat in the 50th floor boardroom. Walking through the front doors was a guaranteed capture. "We need the subterranean freight entrance," I told Kendra, pointing toward the loading docks at the rear of the plaza. "The digital locks on the freight doors are hardwired to the master security grid. If Derek initiated a full building lockdown, standard keycards will trigger a silent alarm at the security desk." Kendra shook her head, pulling a sleek black card from her designer purse. "This is not a standard keycard," she stated firmly. "Wyatt gave me his primary executive override pass last month when I lost my purse. He was too drunk to report it missing. It bypasses the secondary security protocols without logging a user entry in the main registry." We hurried down the concrete ramp toward the massive steel loading doors. Two tactical guards stood near the primary freight elevator, their backs turned as they inspected a delivery manifest. We slipped behind a row of towering shipping pallets. Kendra approached a small heavy metal door marked for maintenance personnel only. She swiped the black executive card against the scanner. A small green light blinked. The heavy magnetic lock disengaged with a soft mechanical click. We stepped inside the dimly lit service corridor. We were inside the fortress, but we were entirely blind to Derek's internal countermeasures. The maintenance corridor smelled of industrial cleaner and ozone. I led Kendra through the labyrinth of exposed pipes and electrical conduits. I knew this sub-level intimately. I mapped the foundational architecture to ensure the central data servers remained isolated from the upper executive floors. We reached the primary service stairwell. We bypassed the lobby level, entirely descending deeper into the structural core of the building. Level 4 housed the master server farm. It was the digital brain of the $56 million empire. The concrete stairwell echoed with our rapid footsteps. We hit the reinforced steel door of sub-level 4. Kendra swiped the executive override card a second time. The door opened into a pristine, hyper-cooled hallway lined with thick bulletproof glass. Beyond the glass stood row after row of blinking black server racks. "We have exactly 20 minutes before the Asian conglomerate signs the final acquisition documents," I said, checking the wall clock. "I need to interface directly with the master terminal inside that room. Once I plug the micro USB drive into the core, I can initiate a hard network lockdown. It will sever all external connections and physically freeze the offshore financial transfer protocols. Derek will be left holding a useless pen." Kendra moved toward the heavy glass door leading into the server farm. She held the black keycard up to the final scanner. Her hand shook slightly, but her resolve was absolute. She was dismantling the only life she had ever known to expose the men who manipulated her. She pressed the card against the glass reader. The scanner chirped cheerfully. The heavy glass door slid open with a rush of freezing air. We stepped into the massive server room. The noise of 1,000 cooling fans roared around us. I walked directly to the central master terminal positioned at the center of the room. It was a sleek aluminum console requiring multi-factor authentication. I did not need Derek's passwords. I had the original foundational source code. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small black micro USB drive I salvaged from the burning trash barrel. I held the mechanism that would instantly bankrupt my traitorous partner. I reached for the terminal port. The massive glass doors behind us suddenly slid shut with a violent hydraulic slam. The electronic keypad on the wall instantly shifted from a glowing green to a solid blaring red. The air conditioning units halted abruptly. An unnatural silence fell over the server room. We were completely sealed inside a bulletproof glass box. A harsh electronic chime echoed from the intercom speaker mounted above the master terminal. Wyatt's voice crackled through the audio feed. His tone was frantic, laced with absolute panic and lingering intoxication. "I see you on the security feed," Wyatt shouted, his voice vibrating with desperate aggression. "I knew you would try to sabotage the servers. You are not ruining this sale. If that money does not transfer to the offshore accounts today, the syndicate will kill me. I am not going to die for your self-righteous crusade." I stared up at the corner security camera. Its red recording light blinked steadily. Wyatt had retreated to the central security hub on the ground floor after fleeing the illegal poker club. He was actively monitoring the subterranean levels, desperate to protect his embezzled payouts. "Open the doors," Wyatt Kendra demanded, stepping into the camera's field of view. "Derek framed my father. He is abandoning you with the corporate debt. You are protecting a man who intends to destroy you." Wyatt let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. "Derek promised me a $2 million severance once the foreign buyers signed the contract," Wyatt snapped back. "I manually overrode the service elevators. I initiated a hard lockdown on the entire 4th sublevel. You are trapped inside a reinforced vault. You cannot hack the terminal if you are dead." The intercom clicked off. The heavy silence returned, broken only by the sound of heavy combat boots pounding against the concrete floor in the exterior hallway. I looked through the thick bulletproof glass walls of the server room. The service stairwell door burst open. 6 tactical military contractors flooded into the hallway. They wore heavy ballistic vests and carried specialized breaching shotguns designed to shatter reinforced glass. Wyatt had dispatched Derek's elite security team directly to our location with orders to eliminate the threat. The contractors surrounded the glass enclosure. The lead guard raised his weapon, aiming the barrel directly at the electronic locking mechanism. We had no secondary exit. The bulletproof glass would withstand standard gunfire, but it would shatter under a concentrated breaching assault. Kendra backed away from the glass, her eyes wide with sudden terror. We were trapped in a subterranean cage while a $56 million empire was being stolen 50 floors above us. The lead contractor pumped the shotgun. I turned my back to the armed men and slammed the micro USB drive directly into the master terminal port. I had to execute the foundational override code before the glass shattered and the armed men breached the room. The deafening roar of a breaching shotgun echoed through the subterranean floor. The reinforced bulletproof glass spiderwebbed instantly but held its frame. Before the tactical contractor could rack a second shell, Derek pushed aggressively through the line of armed men. His face was a mask of pure, unhinged desperation. He grabbed a heavy red fire axe from an emergency wall mount in the corridor. He swung the heavy iron blade directly at the weakened center of the glass. The massive pane shattered inward with a violent explosive crash. A shower of razor-sharp fragments rained down across the pristine server room floor. I did not flinch. The terminal screen flashed a solid green, confirming the master override sequence was fully engaged. The $56 million offshore transfer halted permanently. The corporate network went completely black. Derek stepped over the jagged debris, gripping the wooden handle of the axe with both hands. His expensive, tailored suit was covered in fine glass dust. He realized the system was dead. The realization stripped away the last remnants of his polished executive facade, leaving only raw, feral panic. He let out a guttural roar and lunged directly at me, raising the heavy axe high above his head. He expected a 68-year-old man to cower or freeze in terror. He vastly underestimated the physical toll of a decade spent in a federal maximum security facility. Prison teaches you to read the subtle muscular shifts that precede lethal violence. I watched his shoulders drop. I watched his grip tighten. I did not retreat backward into the dead end of the server racks. I stepped diagonally forward, closing the distance between us. The heavy iron blade sliced through the freezing air, missing my shoulder by less than 2 inches. The sheer momentum of his wild swing threw his entire body off balance. The axe head buried itself deeply into the aluminum casing of the master terminal console, sending a shower of bright electrical sparks into the air. The sparks illuminated his terrified eyes. Kendra screamed from the corner of the room, pressing herself against the far wall to avoid the flying debris. The tactical guards hesitated in the hallway, unsure of how to intervene in a direct physical brawl between the current chief executive and a paroled intruder. Derek grunted, planting his foot against the console base, yanking the wooden handle with all his remaining strength. The wood groaned under the extreme tension. I knew I had a microscopic window of opportunity before he freed the weapon and swung a second time. My survival instinct took total control. I pivoted sharply, planting my left boot firmly on the glass-covered floor for leverage. I brought my right forearm down in a brutal, calculated strike directly against the exposed radial nerve of Derek's forearm. The sharp impact sent a violent shockwave through his arm. His fingers instantly went numb. He dropped the wooden handle of the axe with a sharp gasp of pain. Before he could recover his balance, I grabbed the lapels of his ruined suit jacket. I drove my body weight forward, slamming his back violently against the towering black server racks. The heavy metal equipment groaned under the sudden collision. I pinned his right arm firmly behind his back, forcing his shoulder into a deeply uncomfortable lock. I pressed my forearm across his collarbone, holding him entirely immobilized against the cold steel cages. For 10 years, I imagined this exact physical confrontation. I imagined wrapping my hands around the throat of the man who stole my life, my company, and my wife. But as I held him completely helpless against the server racks, I felt absolutely no desire for violent vengeance. I only felt the cold mechanical necessity of completing my objective. Derek struggled pathetically against my grip. He was a man who spent his entire life manipulating spreadsheets and delegating dirty work to paid subordinates. He possessed absolutely no real physical power. His chest heaved rapidly as he tried to catch his breath. Suddenly, a harsh, wet laugh escaped his lips. He turned his head slightly, spitting a thick glob of blood onto the pristine white floor tile. He bit his own lip during the collision. "You think you won, Wendell?" He sneered, his voice dripping with condescending arrogance despite his physical defeat. "You think crashing a server room makes you a hero. You are nothing but a desperate old convict throwing a tantrum. The Asian conglomerate is not going to walk away from this acquisition just because the screens went dark. I built a bulletproof legal fortress while you were rotting in a cell. You cannot stop the momentum of a $56 million transaction with a simple computer hack. I pressed my forearm tighter against his collarbone, restricting his airflow just enough to silence his rambling. I stopped the offshore transfer, Derek, I stated calmly. The money is not moving to the Cayman Islands. You cannot finalize a sale without the digital infrastructure. The buyers will demand a full technical audit before they sign a single document. Derek chuckled again, a hollow, desperate sound that rattled in his chest. He reached his free left hand awkwardly into his interior breast pocket. He pulled out a crumpled piece of heavy legal parchment. He thrust it blindly backward toward my face. I do not need the digital infrastructure, he spat out, his breath ragged. I bought the legal infrastructure. I took the paper from his trembling hand. I glanced at the heavy black text and the official gold judicial seal stamped at the bottom. It was a formal emergency authorization form signed by a sitting federal judge in the district court. The document explicitly granted Derek absolute manual override power over the corporate holding company in the event of a catastrophic cybersecurity breach. He anticipated an internal sabotage attempt and spent a massive sum of embezzled capital to bribe a corrupt judge. This piece of paper legally bypassed the server lockdown. It allowed him to authorize the $56 million transfer via a direct manual bank wire regardless of the network status. You see, Wendell, he gasped, struggling against my hold. I planned for every single variable. The buyers are waiting in the boardroom right now. I just have to hand them this document and the money clears immediately. You broke into my building, assaulted my security team, and destroyed private property for absolutely no reason. I heard the distinct heavy sound of the elevator doors chiming at the end of the hallway. The tactical contractors parted instantly, creating a wide path. Heavy boots marched decisively toward the shattered server room door. Simon stepped through the broken glass. My former corporate lawyer was not alone. He was flanked by a squad of heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets with bright yellow lettering across their chests. The lead agent, a tall man with a stern, hardened face, stepped directly into the room. He surveyed the shattered glass, the axe buried in the terminal, and my arm pinning Derek against the server racks. He unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. Wendell Harper, the lead agent, announced, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Step away from the executive immediately. You are under arrest for violating the explicit conditions of your federal parole, trespassing on private commercial property, and corporate sabotage. Place your hands behind your back." I released Derek and took a slow, deliberate step backward, raising my hands into the air. The heavy steel of the handcuffs bit sharply into my wrists as the federal agent locked them firmly into place. I did not resist. I stood perfectly still amidst the shattered bulletproof glass of the server room floor. The cold metal was a familiar sensation, a brutal reminder of the 10 years I spent locked in a federal penitentiary for a crime I did not commit. The lead agent pulled my arms tightly behind my back, securing the restraints while barking a series of harsh tactical commands to his squad. Simon stood near the shattered doorway, his face an unreadable mask of legal calculation. He did not intervene to stop the arrest. We had anticipated this exact scenario. Derek leaned against the damaged server rack, clutching his bruised ribs. He coughed heavily, clearing the blood from his throat, but a wide, arrogant smile stretched across his face. He watched the agent secure me with absolute malicious satisfaction. He reached down and picked up the forged judicial override document he had dropped during our physical altercation. He smoothed out the wrinkled parchment, brushing the fine layer of glass dust from his expensive tailored suit. He adjusted his silk tie with shaking fingers, desperately trying to reconstruct the polished facade of a powerful chief executive. "You fought hard." Wendell Derek sneered, his breath ragged but his tone dripping with condescending victory. "You broke into my fortress and you caused a localized disruption. But brute force cannot defeat supreme legal preparation. The Asian conglomerate is sitting in the executive boardroom 50 floors above us right now. They are drinking my champagne. They are waiting for me to walk through those double doors and sign the acquisition papers. I am going to authorize the $56 million offshore transfer manually using this court order. By the time you are processed at the local precinct and thrown back into a maximum security cell, I will be flying over the Atlantic Ocean. You will die behind bars, and I will spend your fortune." He turned to the lead federal agent, flashing a confident corporate smile. "Take this violent paroled felon out through the freight elevator," Derek commanded. "I do not want him terrifying my international investors in the main lobby." Derek turned his back on me and took a decisive step toward the exit, fully believing he had secured his ultimate triumph. "Agent," I said quietly, My voice was a low, steady rumble that cut through the mechanical hum of the backup cooling fans. Before you escort me off this property, I strongly suggest you examine the heavy parchment document protruding from the interior pocket of my canvas jacket. The lead agent stopped pushing me toward the door. He frowned, his hand resting instinctively on his tactical utility belt. He had dealt with desperate criminals before, but he recognized the absolute absence of panic in my voice. Simon stepped forward, instantly bridging the gap between his role as my counsel and his authority as an officer of the court. My client is in possession of a federally authenticated intellectual property patent, Simon stated firmly, locking eyes with the federal agent. If you remove him from this premises without scanning that document, you will be actively facilitating the largest international wire fraud conspiracy in the history of this district. I demand you log the physical evidence before proceeding with the detention. The lead agent glanced at Derek, who had stopped walking. Derek's arrogant smile faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of deeply buried anxiety. Do not listen to them. Derek snapped, his voice rising in sudden panic. He is a convicted corporate saboteur trying to stall his arrest. Get him out of my building immediately. The aggressive defensive nature of Derek's command triggered the agent's professional suspicion. The agent turned back to me. He reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the thick waterproof envelope I had extracted from the downtown bank vault. He opened the seal and pulled out the heavy parchment pages. His eyes scanned the intricate legal phrasing, stopping deliberately at the raised metallic notary seal and the unique federal identification barcode printed squarely at the bottom of the final page. The agent unclipped a rugged tactical digital scanner from his tactical vest. He aimed the red laser directly at the barcode. The device beeped sharply, instantly transmitting the encrypted alphanumeric sequence to the central government intellectual property database. We stood in utter silence for 4 agonizing seconds. The scanner processed the complex inquiry. A bright green light illuminated the device screen, accompanied by a detailed digital readout of the unalterable Federal Registry. The lead agent read the flashing text on his digital monitor. His hardened expression shifted from routine professional annoyance to profound absolute shock. He looked at the physical patent in his hand and then looked directly at Derek. According to the master federal database, the agent announced, his voice echoing loudly in the ruined server room. The foundational source code and all associated intellectual property algorithms utilized by this logistics network do not belong to this corporate entity. They belong entirely to the Horizon Blind Trust, and the sole designated beneficiary of that trust is Wendell Harper. Derek froze completely. The remaining blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. The document he had used to dissolve my shares 10 years ago was a masterful forgery, but it only transferred the physical assets in the corporate shell. I had permanently legally anchored the actual operational algorithm to an external private trust long before the federal raid. The company Derek was attempting to sell to the Asian conglomerate was utterly worthless without the software that ran the global shipping routes. You are currently negotiating a $56 million international acquisition using stolen, non-existent assets, I stated coldly, looking directly into Derek's terrified eyes. The buyers sitting in the boardroom right now are about to sign a contract for a hollow shell. You are actively committing felony wire fraud in the presence of federal law enforcement. Derek dropped his forged judicial override document. It fluttered uselessly to the glass-covered floor. He backed away toward the hallway, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. This is a mistake, Derek stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. He manipulated the registry. He is a hacker. I own this company. The lead agent did not entertain the desperate lies. He holstered his scanner and pulled a small set of keys from his pocket. He stepped behind me and unlocked the heavy steel handcuffs. The metal restraints fell away from my wrists. I rubbed my arms, feeling the circulation return instantly. The agent turned his full attention to Derek. 2 other armed tactical agents moved swiftly across the room, grabbing Derek by the shoulders. They slammed him forcefully against the shattered doorframe. Derek screamed in panic as the agents wrenched his arms behind his back and locked a pair of heavy steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. Derek Vance, the lead agent, declared, "You are under arrest for massive wire fraud, corporate espionage, and perjury." I stood completely free in the center of my reclaimed server room, watching the architect of my destruction weep like a broken child. I stood in the center of the shattered server room, watching the federal agents drag Derek toward the freight elevators. 50 floors above us, inside the main security hub, Wyatt stared at the high-definition surveillance monitors. He watched his infallible father-in-law completely break down in federal handcuffs. The reality of the situation crashed over Wyatt with the brutal force of a derailed freight train. The $56 million acquisition was dead. The corporate accounts were frozen. The $2 million severance package Derek promised him evaporated into thin air. Wyatt was entirely out of time and out of options. He stumbled backward away from the security console, knocking a rolling leather chair to the floor. The violent gambling syndicate expected $250,000 by this afternoon. Without the corporate buyout, Wyatt had absolutely no way to pay his massive debts. His life was in imminent physical danger. He bolted from the security hub, sprinting down the carpeted executive hallway toward his private corner office. His breath came in ragged, terrified gasps. He slammed his office door shut and locked the deadbolt. He rushed to the large abstract painting hanging behind his mahogany desk and tore it off the wall. His trembling fingers fumbled with the digital keypad of his hidden wall safe. He entered the combination and yanked the heavy steel door open. Inside sat bundles of $100 bills. It was the physical cash he skimmed from the vendor accounts over the past 3 months, serving as his absolute last resort emergency fund. It was barely $50,000, but it was enough to purchase a fake passport and a one-way ticket out of the country. Wyatt grabbed a designer leather briefcase from his closet and unzipped the main compartment. He frantically threw the banded stacks of cash inside, not caring how disorganized they fell. He swept his passport and his remaining burner phones into the bag. He zipped the briefcase shut with a sharp, aggressive tug. He did not pack any clothes. He did not leave a note for his wife. He only cared about self-preservation. He unlocked his office door and ran toward the private executive elevator at the end of the corridor. He swiped his access card and pressed the button for the subterranean parking garage. He watched the digital floor indicator descend rapidly, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He believed he was executing a flawless escape. He did not realize my daughter was already waiting for him at the bottom. The polished steel doors of the executive elevator slid open on the lowest level of the corporate parking garage. Wyatt sprinted out, gripping the leather briefcase tightly against his chest. The underground facility was dimly lit and echoed with the sound of distant traffic from the city streets above. He ran desperately toward his bright red luxury sports car parked in the reserved executive bay. He pulled his electronic key fob from his pocket and pressed the unlock button. The headlights flashed twice, illuminating the concrete pillar next to the vehicle. Kendra stepped out from the shadows of the pillar. She stood directly between Wyatt and the driver's side door. She did not look like the terrified, abused woman I saw in the art studio hours earlier. She stood completely upright, radiating the cold, hardened authority she inherited directly from me. She wore a sharp, dark trench coat, her expression completely devoid of any remaining affection. Wyatt skidded to a halt, his expensive leather shoes squeaking loudly against the smooth concrete floor. Kendra, he gasped, his chest heaving as he tried to force a reassuring smile onto his sweating face. Thank God you are here. The federal agents raided the building. Derek is out of his mind. We have to leave the city right now before they freeze our personal assets. Get in the car. Kendra did not move a single inch. She did not yell or cry. She reached into her trench coat and pulled out a thick, heavy legal folder. She held it out, offering it to the man who spent years systematically destroying her self-worth. I am not going anywhere with you, Wyatt, she stated, her voice echoing with lethal, absolute calm. Those are your immediate divorce proceedings. Behind the separation papers is a civil injunction authorized by a municipal judge 20 minutes ago. I filed a formal domestic fraud complaint. Every single personal bank account, credit line, and offshore asset connected to your name is completely frozen. You have absolutely nothing. Wyatt stared at the folder in her hand. His fake smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of raw, predatory panic. He realized his manipulation tactics were entirely useless. He dropped the facade. Move out of my way, Kendra, he growled, stepping aggressively into her personal space. I do not have time for your dramatic games. I am leaving this country today. You are not leaving this city, Kendra replied, her gaze locked onto his frantic, sweating face. You embezzled my inheritance to pay a violent gambling syndicate. You allowed Derek to frame my father. You put your hands on me for the very last time, Wyatt snarled, dropping the legal folder onto the dirty concrete floor. He lunged forward, attempting to violently shove my daughter aside to reach his car door handle. He raised his hand to strike her. The sudden screech of heavy tires burning against the garage ramp interrupted his aggression. Two massive black sport utility vehicles accelerated down the concrete slope, completely blocking the primary exit lane. The vehicles skidded to a halt directly behind Wyatt's red sports car, forming an impenetrable wall of steel. The doors of the SUVs swung open simultaneously. 4 large men wearing dark leather jackets stepped out into the dim fluorescent light. I recognized the man leading the group instantly. It was the same heavily scarred syndicate enforcer I struck with a steel pipe in the alleyway just hours ago. He walked with a pronounced limp, his knee heavily wrapped, but his eyes burned with lethal intent. While the federal agents were arresting Derek upstairs, I used Simon's encrypted phone to send an untraceable anonymous message directly to the syndicate boss. I provided Wyatt's exact location, the specific amount of cash in his briefcase, and his immediate intention to flee the country without settling his debts. The lead enforcer pulled a heavy steel baton from his jacket, tapping it rhythmically against the palm of his hand. Wyatt froze completely. The leather briefcase slipped from his trembling grip, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He looked at the armed men and then looked back at Kendra, his eyes wide with absolute begging terror. "Kendra, please," he whimpered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched sob. "Tell them to stop. Give them your car. Do something to help me." Kendra looked at the terrified, broken man cowering in front of her. She looked at the dark purple bruise still wrapping tightly around her left wrist. She felt absolutely no pity. "You made your own choices, Wyatt," she stated coldly, turning the collar of her coat up against the damp garage air. "Now you can pay for them." Kendra turned her back on her husband and walked away, her footsteps echoing steadily down the concrete corridor. She did not look back as the enforcers closed in on Wyatt. 2 hours after Derek's arrest in the server room, the heavy wrought iron gates of my estate swung open for a second time today. I did not enter on foot, wearing a damp canvas jacket. I sat in the passenger seat of a black government sport utility vehicle. Simon sat in the back seat reviewing a thick stack of certified federal injunctions. A convoy of 3 additional vehicles followed closely behind us, carrying a highly specialized asset forfeiture team from the United States Marshals Service. The private military contractors Derek hired to secure the perimeter were completely gone. They abandoned their posts the moment news of their employer's arrest hit the regional security dispatch. The sprawling manicured lawns looked perfectly still under the crisp mid-morning sun. We parked directly in front of the grand mahogany doors. The lead federal marshal, a broad-shouldered man with a sharp tactical gaze, stepped out and signaled his team to secure the exterior exits. The marshals spread out, rapidly securing the perimeter to prevent any destruction of evidence. They moved with absolute precision. I walked up the stone steps and pushed the heavy front doors open. The vast marble foyer was in a state of absolute frantic chaos. Yvonne stood in the center of the room, surrounded by half a dozen oversized designer suitcases. She was frantically pulling expensive original oil paintings off the walls and shoving priceless antique silver centerpieces into leather duffel bags. She wore the same immaculate silk nightgown from the art studio, but it was now wrinkled and stained with dust from her desperate packing frenzy. The diamond necklace I commissioned for our 20th anniversary swung wildly around her neck as she ripped a framed historical map from its mount. She heard the heavy footsteps of the federal marshals echoing on the marble floor. She spun around, dropping a silver candlestick. It clattered loudly against the pristine stone. She saw the armed federal agents fanning out across the foyer to secure the stolen property. She saw Simon holding a heavy leather briefcase. Then her eyes locked directly onto me. The sheer panic consuming her features hardened instantly into a mask of bitter defensive rage. She realized her escape plan was completely severed. She was trying to strip the estate of its easily liquidated assets before the government arrived. She was exactly 2 hours too late. "You have no right to be in this house," Wendell Yvonne shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceiling. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at the marshals. "I am the legal owner of this property. Derek transferred the primary deed into my private trust 3 years ago. I want these men removed from my foyer immediately, or I am calling my attorneys." I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I walked slowly across the marble floor, stopping exactly 3 feet away from her. Simon stepped forward and unclasped his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick, stapled legal document stamped heavily with the official seal of the Federal District Court. He handed the document directly to me. I extended my arm and pressed the thick stack of papers flat against Yvonne's chest, forcing her to take it. "That is a formal, unchallengeable federal eviction notice, Yvonne," I stated with absolute chilling calm. "You do not own this estate. Derek never owned this estate. When he dissolved my shares 10 years ago, he funded his new corporate shell and purchased this property, utilizing the operational capital he systematically embezzled from my original firm. Derek utilized a complex network of shell corporations to mask the transactions, but the unredacted digital ledgers I extracted exposed the entire financial labyrinth. According to federal asset forfeiture laws, any property acquired utilizing the proceeds of a proven wire fraud conspiracy is subject to immediate government seizure." Simon adjusted his glasses and looked at her with pure professional disdain. "Because my client has provided the authentic intellectual property algorithms proving his absolute ownership of the foundational company. Simon explained. The federal judge signed an emergency asset repatriation order 30 minutes ago. The estate is not being seized by the government to pay restitution. It is being legally transferred entirely back to its original rightful owner. Wendell Harper holds the absolute deed. You are actively trespassing on private property. Yvonne stared at the heavy legal document in her hands. She read the bold black lettering detailing the immediate forfeiture of her luxury vehicles, her offshore banking accounts, and the very ground she stood on. The pristine, wealthy reality she bought with my freedom disintegrated completely. You are trying to leave this house with stolen artifacts purchased with stolen money. I continued, looking down at the packed designer luggage littering the floor. The marshals are here to ensure you do not leave with a single cent of my stolen legacy. You are walking out of here with nothing but the clothes on your back. The heavy federal document slipped from Yvonne's fingers and scattered across the marble floor. The cold, brutal reality of absolute destitution crushed her defensive rage entirely. Her legs gave out beneath her. She dropped heavily to her knees amidst the scattered paperwork and the discarded silver centerpieces. The polished socialite facade completely vanished, leaving only a terrified, desperate woman facing the brutal consequences of her own horrific betrayal. "Wendell, please," she sobbed, grabbing the hem of my damp canvas jacket. Her tears ruined her immaculate makeup, leaving dark streaks down her pale cheeks. "You cannot do this to me. I have nowhere to go. My personal accounts are frozen. My friends will not answer my calls. I am your wife. We spent 30 years together. We built a life together. You cannot throw me into the street." I looked down at the woman kneeling on my floor. I searched my heart for a single ounce of lingering affection or lingering anger. I found absolutely nothing. The emotional detachment was complete and liberating. "We did not build a life together, Yvonne," I replied, my voice echoing with hollow finality. "I built a life. You simply occupied it until a more lucrative offer presented itself. You knew I was an innocent man when the federal agents locked me in a cage. You let me rot in a concrete cell for 3,650 days so you could wear designer silk and host garden parties. 30 years of marriage meant absolutely nothing to you when you weighed it against Derek's stolen bank accounts. You made your choice 10 years ago. Today is simply the bill coming due." I gently but firmly pulled the fabric of my jacket out of her grasping hands. I stepped back and pointed a steady, unwavering finger directly toward the grand mahogany front doors. The lead federal marshal stepped forward, holding out a single small designer suitcase. "We inspected this bag, ma'am," the marshal stated coldly. "It contains standard clothing and basic toiletries. You are permitted to take this single bag. The rest of the luggage remains on site as recovered stolen assets. Stand up and move toward the exit." Yvonne looked at the small bag and then looked up at me one final time, searching for a trace of mercy. She found none. She slowly stood up, wiping her ruined face. She grabbed the handle of the single suitcase and walked out the front doors into the cold November morning, stripped entirely of her wealth, her status, and her dignity. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind her, echoing with absolute finality across the marble foyer. 6 months passed since the morning I handed Yvonne her eviction notice in the marble foyer. The transition of power back into my hands was not a simple administrative process. It was a brutal corporate war fought in boardrooms and federal courts. Derek had infected my logistics empire with a deep systemic rot. I spent my first 90 days back as chief executive officer, completely dismantling the poisoned hierarchy he left behind. I called an emergency mandatory meeting for the entire board of directors. These were the exact same men and women who enthusiastically voted to dissolve my shares 10 years ago. They sat around the massive mahogany table in the executive suite, looking nervous but incredibly arrogant. They believed their lucrative golden parachute contracts would protect them from immediate termination. I walked into the room carrying a thick stack of forensic accounting reports generated by Simon and a team of federal auditors. I dropped the heavy binders onto the center of the table. I did not raise my voice. I informed them that the internal investigation revealed their direct complicity in approving Derek's illegal offshore transfers. I gave them 2 options. They could resign immediately, relinquishing all severance packages and corporate stock options, or they could face federal indictments for accessory to wire fraud. The room erupted into frantic, panicked arguments. I stood at the head of the table in absolute silence, watching their inflated egos crumble under the weight of undeniable legal evidence. By the end of the hour, the room was completely empty. I fired every single corrupt executive Derek had hired to insulate his crimes. I replaced the hollow corporate culture with a regime of unyielding transparency. I implemented strict digital oversight protocols, anchoring the financial approval processes directly to my personal biometric signature. The overseas buyers who nearly purchased the stolen company attempted to file a massive civil lawsuit for breach of contract. I shut their legal team down instantly by threatening to expose their willingness to purchase stolen intellectual property to international trade regulators. The logistics network stabilized. The bleeding stopped entirely. The empire I built from a single delivery truck was finally breathing clean air again. The heavy lifting of the corporate restructuring required an operational mind I could trust implicitly. I found that mind sitting across from me in my private office. Kendra reviewed a stack of international shipping manifests, her eyes scanning the complex data with sharp, focused precision. The dark, heavy circles that shadowed her eyes 6 months ago were completely gone. The physical and emotional bruises Wyatt inflicted upon her had healed entirely. She no longer wore the restrictive designer clothing Derek forced her to wear to portray a fragile, helpless socialite. She wore a sharp, tailored suit projecting the hardened, capable authority of an executive leader. She had spent the last half-year working relentlessly alongside me, learning the intricate mechanics of the global supply chain. She proved her fierce competence every single day. I closed my laptop and looked at my only daughter. I slid a heavy leather-bound folder across my desk. Kendra opened the cover and read the top document. It was a formal corporate contract naming her the new Vice President of Operations for the entire logistics network. She looked up at me, her eyes shining with genuine surprise and profound gratitude. "You earned this position, Kendra," I stated firmly. "You did not get this job because you share my last name. You secured this role because you possess the absolute strength to protect this company from anyone who tries to tear it down. We do not operate on blind trust anymore. We operate on verifiable truth." Kendra nodded, her expression radiating a deep, quiet pride. She signed the employment contract with a steady hand. Our relationship was no longer built on the fabricated lies Derek had forced between us. We stripped away the resentment and the manufactured anger. We replaced the toxic manipulation with a foundation of absolute transparency and mutual respect. We spent hours talking openly about the missing 10 years. I told her the truth about my sacrifice, and she told me the truth about the psychological cage she lived in under her mother's roof. We were finally a family again, functioning as an unbreakable, unified front against the rest of the corporate world. I left the corporate headquarters late in the evening and drove myself back to my $12 million estate. I did not park near the damp, decaying stables. I pulled my vehicle directly into the primary executive garage. I walked through the grand mahogany front doors without needing to punch a code or beg for entry. The massive house was quiet, but it was no longer the suffocating, oppressive silence I experienced on my first night out of prison. It was a deeply peaceful, restorative silence. I walked through the expansive living room and stepped out onto the wide stone balcony overlooking the lower gardens. The crisp spring breeze carried the scent of blooming hydrangeas. The usurpers who occupied my home were completely eradicated. Derek was currently sitting in a maximum security federal penitentiary beginning a 20-year sentence for massive corporate fraud and perjury. He would spend the rest of his life locked in a concrete cell identical to the one he forced me into a decade ago. Wyatt had vanished entirely. After Kendra froze his accounts and the syndicate enforcers cornered him in the parking garage, he became a ghost. The authorities suspected he fled the country on a cargo ship, but the violent men he owed money to were still actively hunting him. Yvonne was completely destitute. Without her stolen wealth and her fabricated social status, her wealthy friends abandoned her instantly. She was living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in the industrial sector, working a minimum-wage retail job just to survive. I did not seek violent revenge against any of them. Physical violence is a temporary release that ultimately destroys the victor. I chose a far more devastating and permanent path. I utilized extreme patience, meticulous calculation, and absolute truth to dismantle their stolen lives. I systematically restored order to my universe. I took a slow, deep breath of the clean evening air. I leaned against the heavy stone railing and looked out over the sprawling acreage I purchased with my own blood and sweat. The iron gates at the bottom of the driveway were open. The nightmare was officially over. I was firmly in control of my legacy once more. If you found value in this story, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and do not forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience and redemption.